The chapel bell hasn't rung properly in 37 years. Not since the rope mechanism broke during Hurricane Agnes back in 1972. My name is Sister Margaret, and I've served as sacristan at Our Lady of Sorrows Convent for the past 15 years. It's my responsibility to maintain the chapel, prepare for daily Mass, and ensure everything runs smoothly for our community of 43 sisters. The work suits me. I've always found peace in routine, in the quiet satisfaction of polishing brass candlesticks and arranging fresh flowers on the altar. There's something sacred about preparing a space for worship, making it worthy of prayer and contemplation. Our convent sits on 12 acres of rolling hills in rural Pennsylvania, established in 1896 by German immigrants who came seeking religious freedom. The original chapel, with its soaring Gothic windows and hand-carved oak pews, remains the heart of our community. The bell tower, rising 8 stories above the nave, houses a bronze bell cast in Munich and blessed by 3 different bishops over the decades. Or it did, until Sister Catherine's accident last month. Sister Catherine had been our bell ringer for 22 years, climbing those narrow stone steps twice daily to call us to morning lauds and evening vespers. She was 81 and moved slowly, but insisted on maintaining her duty, despite Mother Superior's gentle suggestions that perhaps a younger sister should take over. "The bells know my hands," Sister Catherine would say with that stubborn smile of hers. "They sing differently for each person who rings them." On the morning of October 15th, Sister Catherine didn't appear for morning prayers. Sister Anne found her at the base of the bell tower stairs, her neck broken from what appeared to be a fall. The coroner ruled it accidental death, worn stone steps, poor lighting, the inevitable frailty of advanced age. We buried her in our small cemetery 3 days later, and Mother Superior ordered the bell rope disconnected as a safety precaution. "No more climbing those dangerous stairs," she declared. "We'll use the electric chimes for our calls to prayer." That should have been the end of it. But 3 weeks ago, the bell began ringing again. It started on a Tuesday night. I was in my cell, reading evening prayers, when the deep bronze voice of our chapel bell rolled across the convent grounds. 3 slow, measured peals at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning. I assumed someone had reconnected the mechanism without telling me. Perhaps Mother Superior had changed her mind about the safety restrictions. But when I mentioned it at breakfast, the other sisters looked puzzled. No one had heard anything. Sister Anne, whose cell is directly beneath the bell tower, insisted she'd slept soundly all night. Only Sister Frances, our oldest resident at 94, nodded knowingly. "Sister Catherine always said 3 o'clock was the most sacred hour," she whispered. "The hour of Christ's death." The second night, I stayed awake and listened. Again, at precisely 3 a.m., 3 clear bell tones echoed through the darkness. This time I crept to my window and looked up at the tower. In the pale moonlight, I could see the bell swaying gently, as if someone had just finished pulling the rope, but the rope had been removed and stored in the maintenance shed. I mentioned this to Mother Superior during our weekly conference, but she seemed distracted, overwhelmed by the paperwork involved in settling Sister Catherine's affairs. "Perhaps it's the wind," she suggested absently. "Old buildings make strange noises, Sister Margaret. You know this better than anyone." But I knew every sound this convent made. I'd heard the settling timbers in winter, the whistling drafts through ancient window frames, the creaking floorboards in the corridors. This wasn't the building speaking, this was our bell, ringing with the same rhythm and cadence Sister Catherine had used for over 2 decades. On the 7th night, I decided to investigate. I dressed quietly and slipped out of my cell at 2:45 a.m., making my way through the darkened corridors to the chapel. The heavy oak doors stood slightly ajar, though I distinctly remembered securing them after evening prayers. Inside, the sanctuary was filled with that peculiar stillness that comes just before dawn, when the world holds its breath in anticipation of morning. The bell tower entrance was locked, but I had keys to every door in the convent. The narrow spiral staircase wound upward through cold stone walls, each step worn smooth by generations of faithful feet. My flashlight beam danced ahead of me, creating strange shadows that seemed to retreat as I climbed higher. The air grew thinner and colder with each level, carrying the faint scent of incense and something else, something floral and sweet, that reminded me of the lilacs Sister Catherine had loved to arrange on the altar each spring. At 3 o'clock exactly, the bell began to ring above my head. I climbed faster, my heart hammering against my ribs. The bronze voice filled the narrow stairwell, each peal vibrating through my bones and making my teeth ache. When I finally reached the bell chamber, I pressed my back against the stone wall and raised my flashlight. Sister Catherine knelt in the center of the small room, her hands clasped in prayer position, her lips moving silently. She wore the same simple black habit she'd been buried in, though now it seemed somehow luminous in the flashlight beam, as if woven from moonlight and shadow. Her face was turned upward toward the great bronze bell that swayed above her head, moved by invisible hands that pulled the vanished rope with perfect timing. I tried to speak, to call her name, but my voice had fled. Sister Catherine's skin was pale as candle wax, and when I stepped closer, I felt the cold radiating from her body like winter air from an open grave. Her chest barely moved, a shallow, mechanical rising and falling that seemed more memory than breath. But her lips continued their silent prayer, forming words I couldn't hear over the bell's resonant voice. The ringing stopped as suddenly as it had begun. In the sudden silence, I heard Sister Catherine whisper, "Forgive me, Mother. I must finish my duty." Her eyes opened and met mine, cloudy and distant, like looking through frosted glass at something very far away. I ran then, stumbling down the spiral stairs in the dark, my flashlight forgotten in the bell chamber. By the time I reached my cell, my hands were shaking so violently I could barely turn the door handle. The next morning, I climbed to the bell chamber again, expecting to find nothing but empty space and morning light. Instead, I found my flashlight lying on the stone floor, still burning weakly. Beside it was a single white lily, fresh as if just cut from the garden, though our lilies had been dead since the first frost weeks ago. I never told Mother Superior what I saw that night. Some mysteries are too sacred for official reports and rational explanations. But every morning at 3:15, I climbed to the bell chamber to retrieve the lily. Sister Catherine leaves there, and every evening I place fresh flowers on her grave in our small cemetery. The bell still rings at 3 a.m., calling us to a prayer service that exists only in the space between this world and the next. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the chapel after evening vespers, I hear Sister Catherine's voice, joining our evening hymns, thin and distant, but unmistakably hers, carrying the melody she loved so much in life and continues to serve in death. Some faces become more familiar in death than they ever were in life. I am Mother Superior Ruth, and I have governed Our Lady of Perpetual Help Convent for 18 years. In that time, I presided over 43 professions, 27 Jubilee celebrations, and 61 funerals. I know every sister in our community by the sound of her footsteps on the chapel floor, by the particular way she holds her hands during prayer, by the slight variations in how she recites the familiar responses during Mass. This knowledge comes naturally. When you live in close quarters with the same people for decades, you become attuned to the smallest details of communal life. Our evening prayers begin at 7 o'clock sharp, when the last rays of sunlight filter through the stained glass windows and cast jeweled patterns across the worn oak pews. 41 sisters file into the chapel with quiet precision, each taking her assigned place according to her years of service and current responsibilities. Sister Marie, our organist, provides gentle accompaniment from the century-old Steinway that came with the convent when we purchased it from the Episcopal Church in 1949. The ritual is always the same. We begin with the Rosary, move through evening scripture readings, and conclude with Compline, the night prayer that has marked the end of each monastic day for over 15 centuries. I lead these services from the front pew, facing the altar, though I frequently turn to observe my community during our collective prayers. It's part of my pastoral responsibility to ensure everyone is present, healthy, and spiritually engaged with our shared devotions. 3 months ago, I began noticing an irregularity in our evening attendance. Sitting in the back pew, always in the same spot on the far right near the confessional, was an elderly nun I didn't immediately recognize. She appeared to be in her 80s, with deep lines etched around her eyes and mouth, and silver hair that showed beneath her black veil. Her habit looked older than the ones we currently wear. The fabric seemed heavier, more substantial, and the cut was slightly different from our modern adaptations. But what struck me most was her extraordinary devotion during prayers. Her lips moved constantly, keeping perfect time with our recitations, and her weathered hands worked a rosary with practiced efficiency. At first, I assumed she was a visiting sister from another convent, perhaps staying with us temporarily while traveling or on retreat. Such visits were common, though usually arranged through correspondence with other Mother Superiors. I made a mental note to check our guest registry and speak with Sister Dorothy, who manages our hospitality arrangements. But when I consulted our records, there was no mention of any visiting religious. Our guest quarters had been empty for 3 weeks. Sister Dorothy confirmed that she hadn't prepared any additional meals or arranged any temporary accommodations. Yet the elderly nun continued to appear each evening, always in the same pew, always participating fully in our prayers. I began watching her more carefully during our services. She arrived after the rest of us had taken our places. I never saw her enter through the main chapel doors or through the side entrance near the sacristy. She was simply there when I turned around for our opening responses, as if she had materialized from the shadows near the confessional. Her voice, when she joined our recitations, was thin and reedy but carried clearly through the chapel. She knew all the prayers by heart, even some of the older Latin responses that our younger sisters struggled with. After several weeks of this pattern, I decided to approach her directly. During our closing benediction, I positioned myself to intercept her as she left the chapel. But when I turned around after the final Amen, her pew was empty. The other sisters were filing out through the main doors, moving with their usual quiet efficiency, but the mysterious nun had vanished. Sister Patricia, who sat 2 pews ahead of the visitor's usual spot, confirmed that she had seen and heard the elderly nun throughout the entire service. Such beautiful Latin pronunciation. Sister Patricia commented, she must have learned the old liturgy before Vatican II. But like me, Sister Patricia had no idea where the woman had gone after prayers ended. The following evening, I took a different approach. Instead of leading prayers from my usual position, I stationed myself near the back of the chapel where I could observe the last pew directly. The elderly nun appeared as always, settling into her customary spot with a soft rustle of fabric. I watched her throughout our 45-minute service, noting the graceful way she genuflected, the reverent manner in which she held her prayer book, the soft murmur of her voice during the communal responses. When we reached the final blessing, I kept my eyes fixed on her location. She remained seated as the other sisters filed out, her head bowed in what appeared to be private prayer. I waited until the chapel was empty except for the 2 of us, then walked slowly down the center aisle toward her pew. "Sister," I called softly, "might I have a word with you?" She looked up at me with pale blue eyes that seemed both ancient and oddly familiar. Her face was deeply lined but serene, marked by decades of prayer and contemplation. When she smiled, I felt a strange recognition tug at the edges of my memory. Something about the shape of her mouth, the particular way she tilted her head when listening. "Of course, Mother Ruth," she said in a voice like dry leaves rustling. "Though I fear our time is nearly finished." I blinked, and she was gone. Not vanished in a dramatic fashion, simply no longer there, as if she had never existed at all. The pew was empty, still warm from where she had been sitting, and the air held a faint scent of lavender and old roses. the kind of fragrance that clings to garments stored in cedar chests for decades. On the wooden seat, where she had been sitting, I found a rosary. It was old, much older than the plastic and metal rosaries our sisters typically used. The beads were carved from dark wood, worn smooth by countless prayers, and connected by a thin silver chain that had tarnished to a warm gray. The crucifix was particularly beautiful, cast in pewter and engraved with tiny flowers around the edges. But what made my hands tremble as I picked it up was the small silver medal attached to the chain, a medallion I recognized from the inventory records in our archives. Back in my office, I pulled out the leather-bound ledger where we recorded the personal effects of deceased sisters. The entry for Sister Agnes, who died of pneumonia in February of 1967, listed among her possessions one rosary, wooden beads, silver chain, pewter crucifix with floral engraving, Saint Therese medallion. The rosary had been buried with her according to her final wishes and our traditional practices. I examined the medallion more closely under my desk lamp. Engraved on the back in tiny script were the words, Sister Agnes Mary Final Vows, June 21, 1923. The metal was tarnished, but the engraving was still clearly legible, exactly matching the description in our records. The next evening, I waited in the back pew myself, holding Sister Agnes's rosary in my hands. She appeared as always, taking her customary place beside me with a gentle nod of acknowledgement. This time, I could see her more clearly in the soft candlelight, the familiar bone structure that I now recognized from old photograph albums in our archives. The same serene expression she wore in her final portrait, taken just months before her death. "You've been very patient with me, Mother Ruth," she said softly, her voice barely audible beneath our communal prayers. But I needed to ensure our evening devotions continued properly. Some of the younger sisters rushed through the responses. I wanted to ask her so many questions about death, about the afterlife, about why she had returned to our simple chapel. But as I opened my mouth to speak, she placed one translucent finger against her lips and shook her head gently. "Prayer time," she whispered, and joined her voice to our evening hymn. When the service ended, she remained in the pew beside me as the other sisters filed out. In the growing darkness, I could barely make out her profile, though I felt her presence as clearly as if she were fully alive and breathing beside me. "The rosary belongs to you now," she said finally. "Use it well. And Mother Ruth, thank you for letting me pray with you. It's been such a comfort these past months to worship with my sisters again." I felt her hand briefly touch mine, cold as winter air, but somehow reassuring. When I looked up from the rosary in my lap, she was gone, leaving only the faint scent of lavender and the lingering warmth of human kindness. I still lead evening prayers from the front of the chapel, but I always glance back toward the last pew during our closing benediction. Sometimes, especially on feast days, or during our most solemn observances, I catch a glimpse of movement in the shadows. Near the confessional, a familiar figure, in an old-fashioned habit, praying with the same devotion she brought to these services for 44 years of religious life. Sister Agnes's rosary hangs from my belt now, and I use it for my personal prayers each morning and evening. The wooden beads are still warm to the touch, as if they remember the countless hours they spent in faithful hands, marking off Hail Marys and Our Fathers in the eternal rhythm of monastic prayer that continues even beyond the boundaries of mortal life. Death, I've learned, doesn't always mean the end of prayer. My name is Sister Claire, and I serve as infirmarian at St. Martha's Convent in the mountains of West Virginia. For the past 12 years, I've cared for our elderly and ailing sisters, administering medications, coordinating with physicians, and providing comfort during their final days. It's a calling that requires both clinical knowledge and deep compassion, the ability to ease physical suffering while tending to spiritual needs in those precious hours between life and whatever comes after. Our infirmary occupies the entire second floor of the convent's east wing, with 8 private rooms for sisters requiring extended care, and a small chapel where we hold bedside masses for those too ill to attend services in the main sanctuary. The rooms are simple but comfortable, each furnished with a hospital bed, a wooden chair for visitors, and a small altar where we place religious images and fresh flowers. Large windows face the mountains, offering views of the forested hills that change dramatically with each season. Sister Mary Dolores had been in my care for 6 months before she died. At 87, she suffered from advanced arthritis and chronic heart problems that gradually weakened her until she could barely leave her bed. But her mind remained sharp until the very end, and her devotion to prayer never wavered. Even on her worst days, when pain medications left her drowsy and confused, I would find her lips moving silently, working through the rosary that she kept constantly in her hands. She died on a Tuesday evening in early November, just as the first snow was beginning to fall outside her window. I was sitting beside her bed, reading from the Book of Psalms, when her breathing became shallow and irregular. Mother Superior arrived within minutes of my call, along with Sister Anne, who served as our chaplain. We administered the last rites while Sister Mary's eyes remained fixed on the wooden crucifix hanging above her bed, her lips still moving in what appeared to be silent prayer. The moment of death came peacefully, a gradual cessation of breath that seemed more like falling asleep than any violent departure from life. Sister Anne closed Sister Mary's eyes and folded her hands over her chest, placing her beloved rosary between her fingers in the traditional position for viewing. Mother Superior whispered a brief prayer of commendation, and we left Sister Mary's body in peaceful repose while arrangements were made for the funeral mass. According to our customs, one sister always maintains vigil with the deceased, from the time of death until burial. This practice ensures that our departed sister is never alone and provides opportunity for continuous prayer during the sacred transition between earthly life and eternal rest. As infirmarian, I volunteered to take the first shift, settling into the bedside chair with my own prayer book and rosary. Sister Mary's room felt different after her death, not frightening, but somehow more present, as if the veil between worlds had grown thin in the hours immediately following her passing. The late autumn wind rattled the windows, and the heating system's familiar hum seemed more noticeable in the profound silence. I arranged fresh chrysanthemums on her bedside altar and lit 2 white candles that cast gentle shadows across her still features. For the first several hours, everything remained peaceful and normal. I read silently from the breviary, occasionally offering spoken prayers for Sister Mary's soul and for the comfort of our community, as we prepared to say goodbye to one of our most beloved members. Outside, the snow continued falling, creating a white blanket that muffled all sound from the world beyond our convent walls. Around midnight, I began to notice something unusual. Sister Mary's mouth was moving not dramatically, but with the subtle rhythmic motion of lips forming silent words. At first, I assumed this was some kind of post-mortem muscle contraction, a natural part of the body's adjustment to death. But as I watched more carefully, I realized the movements were too regular, too purposeful to be random physiological responses. Her lips were moving in the exact pattern of Hail Mary prayers. I counted silently, along with her movements. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. 10 repetitions, followed by a pause that corresponded perfectly to the Our Father. Then 10 more Hail Marys. She was praying the rosary, working through the decades, with the same steady rhythm she had maintained throughout her final months of illness. I tried to tell myself this was imagination, the product of fatigue and the emotional strain of losing someone I had cared for so intensively. But as the hours passed, Sister Mary's silent prayers continued with mechanical precision. Her eyelids remained closed, her body perfectly still except for the gentle movement of her lips, forming words that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than breath or consciousness. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, I noticed something else. The rosary in Sister Mary's folded hands was shifting position. Not dramatically, just small, almost imperceptible movements as individual beads slid between her fingers. When I leaned closer to examine this phenomenon, I could see that her thumbs were moving in tiny increments, advancing the rosary beads in perfect synchronization with her silent prayers. The rational part of my mind insisted this was impossible. Sister Mary had been dead for over 6 hours. Her body temperature had dropped. Her muscles had begun the natural stiffening process, and there was no pulse or breathing to sustain any kind of voluntary movement. Yet I was witnessing what appeared to be deliberate, coordinated prayer activity continuing long after clinical death. I considered calling Mother Superior, but hesitated. What could I possibly say? That our deceased sister was praying? That death hadn't interrupted her decades-long habit of nightly rosary recitations? Such claims would sound like the fantasies of an overwrought imagination, the kind of religious hysteria that brings shame to contemplative communities. Instead, I decided to document what I was observing. In a small notebook, I recorded the time of each rosary decade, noting the consistent 15-minute intervals that matched Sister Mary's usual prayer rhythm. I also sketched the positions of the rosary beads, marking their gradual progress through the mysteries as her fingers worked silently through each cycle of prayers. By dawn, Sister Mary had completed 4 full rosaries, exactly the number she typically prayed each night before falling asleep. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through her window, the movements gradually slowed and finally stopped entirely. Her lips settled into peaceful stillness, and the rosary beads remained motionless in her hands. But something had changed during those hours of posthumous prayer. When I examined the rosary more closely in the morning light, I noticed that the wooden beads appeared more worn than I remembered, their surfaces smoothed to a deeper patina, as if they had been handled for decades longer than Sister Mary's 12 years of religious life. The silver chain showed additional tarnishing, and the crucifix bore tiny scratches that suggested constant use over an extended period. Sister Anne arrived at 7 o'clock to relieve me for the morning shift. As we exchanged pleasantries and discussed the funeral arrangements, I debated whether to share what I had witnessed during the night. But when Sister Anne commented on how peaceful Sister Mary looked, how her expression seemed almost radiant in the early morning light, I decided to keep my observations private. Some experiences are too sacred for casual discussion, too mysterious for rational explanation. What I witnessed during that long vigil wasn't frightening. It was profoundly comforting. Sister Mary had spent her entire religious life in faithful prayer, and apparently death itself couldn't interrupt her conversation with God. If anything, her passing had freed her from the physical limitations that had made prayer difficult during her final months of illness. The funeral mass took place 3 days later in our main chapel, attended by the entire community and several of Sister Mary's family members who traveled from Ohio for the service. Mother Superior delivered a beautiful eulogy about Sister Mary's 70 years of religious life and her unwavering devotion to contemplative prayer. We buried her in our small cemetery, placing her worn rosary in the casket according to her final wishes. But sometimes, during my night rounds in the infirmary, I pause outside the room where Sister Mary died. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the wind moves through the mountain pines and the building settles into its deepest silence, I occasionally hear the faint whisper of prayers continuing in that sacred space, the soft murmur of Hail Marys being recited by a voice too distant to identify, but too familiar to ignore. Prayer, it seems, is a conversation that death merely relocates rather than terminates. And for those who have spent their lives in faithful dialogue with the divine, the transition from earthly petition to heavenly intercession may be far more seamless than any of us realize during our brief moments of mortal observation. Some deaths bloom more beautifully than others. I am Sister Rose, and I have served as gardener at Sacred Heart Convent for 23 years. My work involves maintaining the flower beds around our chapel, growing vegetables for our kitchen, and tending the small cemetery where we lay our deceased sisters to rest. It's a calling that suits my temperament. I've always found God more easily in soil and growing things than in abstract theological discussions. There's something profoundly sacred about participating in the cycles of planting, nurturing, and harvesting that mirror the spiritual rhythms of religious life. Our convent grounds encompass 15 acres of rolling farmland in southern Missouri, with rich black soil that supports almost anything we choose to grow. The vegetable gardens occupy the sunny eastern slope, while our flower beds surround the main buildings in carefully planned arrangements that provide color and fragrance throughout the growing season. The cemetery sits on a gentle hillside behind the chapel, enclosed by a low stone wall and shaded by oak trees that were planted when the convent was established in 1889. We follow traditional burial practices, laying our sisters to rest in simple pine coffins marked by wooden crosses, bearing their religious names and the dates of their earthly service. No elaborate monuments or expensive caskets, just the fundamental dignity of bodies returning to the earth that sustained them during life. I plant flowers on each grave according to the season and the preferences the sisters expressed while living, creating a garden of memory that changes and grows throughout the year. Sister Teresa had been our librarian for 38 years before her death from cancer in March of last year. She was 74 when she died, a quiet woman who found her greatest joy in organizing our collection of theological books and helping younger sisters with their research projects. During her final months, when the illness confined her to the infirmary, she would ask me to bring fresh flowers from the garden, always roses, if they were in season, because they reminded her of her childhood home in Arkansas. I buried her on a cold morning, when the last snow was melting into muddy rivulets across the cemetery paths. The grave was located in the newest section, where we had recently cleared space for future burials. I planted her favorite varieties around the headstone, 3 rose bushes that should have remained dormant until late spring, when the soil warmed and the danger of frost had passed. But Sister Teresa's roses began blooming within a week of her burial. At first, I assumed this was some kind of fluke, a brief warm spell that confused the plants into premature flowering. But as days passed and the weather returned to typical March conditions, with freezing nights and overcast skies, the roses continued producing perfect blooms in defiance of natural seasons. Deep red flowers opened each morning, their petals undamaged by frost, their fragrance as rich and complex as anything I'd achieved during optimal growing conditions. I consulted my gardening references and spoke with the county extension agent, trying to understand what might cause roses to bloom so dramatically out of season. The explanations ranged from unusual soil conditions to residual heat from the burial process, but none of the theories addressed the most puzzling aspect of the phenomenon. The roses were thriving in conditions that should have killed them outright. By late April, when my other rose bushes were just beginning to show new growth, Sister Teresa's plants had produced dozens of perfect blooms and were displaying the kind of vigorous growth I typically associated with midsummer. The stems were thick and strong, the foliage deep green and abundant, and the flowers continued opening in steady succession despite the cool, wet weather that was hampering growth throughout the rest of the garden. Other sisters began commenting on the unusual display. Sister Margaret, who managed our altar flowers, requested permission to cut some of Sister Teresa's roses for Sunday Mass. But when she attempted to harvest them, the stems refused to separate from the plants, not because they were particularly tough, but because they seemed somehow unwilling to be severed from their roots. The cutting shears would approach the stem, then somehow slip or deflect, as if the roses were protected by some invisible shield. By summer, the phenomenon had become even more remarkable. While my other rose plants struggled through a severe drought that lasted 6 weeks, Sister Teresa's roses flourished without any supplemental watering. The soil around her grave remained moist and dark, even during the hottest days, when the surrounding ground cracked from lack of moisture. The flowers were larger and more vibrant than anything I'd ever achieved through careful cultivation and regular feeding. But the most extraordinary development occurred in November, when I was preparing the cemetery for winter. As I was clearing fallen leaves from around Sister Teresa's headstone, I noticed something unusual about the wooden cross that marked her grave. It was growing, not dramatically, just small changes that became apparent when I examined it closely. The vertical beam showed signs of new growth at the base, with tiny rootlets extending into the soil around the grave. The horizontal crosspiece had developed small buds along its length, like a branch preparing for spring growth. The wood itself seemed different, less weathered, more alive, with the subtle flexibility of living timber rather than the rigid dryness of seasoned lumber. I brought Mother Superior to examine the phenomenon, though I wasn't sure how to explain what I was observing. Together, we crouched beside Sister Teresa's grave, while I pointed out the subtle signs of growth in what should have been dead wood. Mother Superior listened patiently, then knelt to examine the cross more closely. "The wood appears to be oak," she observed, running her fingers along the vertical beam. "Perhaps it was cut from green timber and is responding to moisture in the soil." But we both knew this explanation was inadequate. The cross had been crafted from seasoned lumber, properly dried, and treated to withstand outdoor weather conditions. I had installed dozens of similar markers over the years, and none had ever shown signs of renewed life after installation. Winter arrived with unusual severity that year, temperatures dropping below zero for weeks at a time, with snow accumulating to depths I hadn't seen in decades. The entire garden lay dormant under frozen ground and thick ice, waiting for spring's eventual return. Every plant on the convent grounds succumbed to the harsh conditions, retreating into protective dormancy until warmer weather could coax them back to life. Except for Sister Teresa's roses. Throughout December and January, perfect blooms continued opening above the snow-covered grave. The flowers were smaller than their summer counterparts, but no less beautiful, their red petals providing the only color in a landscape reduced to black and white. I would find them each morning during my winter rounds, fresh roses lying on the snow around Sister Teresa's headstone, as if they had fallen from some invisible source during the night. By February, the wooden cross had grown nearly 6 inches taller, with the horizontal beam extending outward to form what looked like the beginning of natural branches. Bark was developing along the vertical post, and I could see the swelling that indicated bud formation in multiple locations. Sister Teresa's grave marker was transforming into a living tree, rooted in the soil that held her earthly remains. The roses reached their most extraordinary display during Holy Week of the following spring. On Palm Sunday, I discovered that every bush around Sister Teresa's grave had produced white blooms overnight, pure white roses that seemed to glow in the early morning light. By Good Friday, the flowers had deepened to a soft pink, and on Easter morning, they had returned to their original deep red, but with an intensity of color I had never achieved in decades of careful cultivation. The wooden cross, now clearly recognizable as a young oak tree, had leafed out with the tender green foliage of early spring. Its branches formed a perfect cross shape, as if guided by some divine geometry that maintained the sacred symbolism while allowing natural growth to proceed. Birds began nesting in its developing canopy, and I noticed that other plants grew more vigorously in its shade. I continued tending Sister Teresa's grave with the same care I give to all sections of our cemetery, though her roses require no fertilizer, no pruning, no protection from pests or disease. They bloom according to their own mysterious schedule, providing flowers for our altar arrangements and filling the air with fragrance that seems to carry the essence of prayer itself. The oak tree that grew from her grave marker now stands 15 feet tall, its branches reaching toward heaven, while its roots anchor deep in the earth, where Sister Teresa's body rests in peaceful sleep. During our evening walks through the cemetery, I often pause beside this living memorial, wondering at the mystery of death that sometimes manifests not as ending, but as transformation into something even more beautiful than what came before. Some graves hold only memory, but Sister Teresa's grave holds promise. The promise that death is not the conclusion of growth, but simply its translation into forms we rarely have the vision to perceive or the faith to accept. Some sins follow us beyond the grave, seeking absolution that death couldn't provide. My name is Sister Anne, and I serve as sacristan and assistant chaplain at Mount Carmel Convent in the hills of eastern Kentucky. Among my duties is maintaining our chapel's confessional booth, a beautifully carved walnut structure that dates back to the convent's founding in 1907. The booth consists of 3 sections: a central chamber for the priest, flanked by 2 smaller compartments where penitents kneel to confess their sins. Though we rarely host formal confession services anymore, the booth remains an important part of our chapel's traditional architecture and spiritual heritage. Our community includes 36 sisters, ranging in age from 28 to 91, along with occasional retreatants who come seeking spiritual direction or contemplative silence. Most of our formal sacraments are administered by Father McKenna, who drives up from the Valley Parish every Sunday to celebrate Mass and tend to our spiritual needs. But during the week, we maintain our own prayer schedules and handle the routine maintenance of our sacred spaces without outside assistance. Sister Magdalene had been one of our most devoted members before her sudden death from a heart attack 3 weeks ago. At 73, she possessed an intensity of faith that sometimes made younger sisters uncomfortable. She would spend hours in prayer before the Blessed Sacrament, often remaining in the chapel long after evening prayers had concluded. Her devotion was admirable but also somewhat obsessive, particularly regarding what she called unfinished business with God. During her final months, Sister Magdalene had become increasingly agitated about something she wouldn't discuss with Mother Superior or any of the other sisters. She would mutter about work left undone and promises not kept, though when pressed for details, she would only say that some matters needed to be resolved before she could rest peacefully. Her death came suddenly during morning prayer. She simply collapsed at her pew and was gone before Sister Dorothy could summon medical help. We buried Sister Magdalene in our small cemetery, according to our traditional practices, laying her to rest in the simple wooden coffin she had requested. Wearing the black habit she had worn for 46 years of religious life, Father McKenna conducted a beautiful funeral mass, and the entire community participated in the burial ceremony on a gray October morning, when the first frost had turned the surrounding maple trees brilliant shades of red and gold. For 2 weeks after the funeral, everything proceeded normally. Our prayer schedules continued without interruption. The autumn maintenance projects progressed on schedule, and the community gradually adjusted to Sister Magdalene's absence from our daily routines. But on the 3rd Tuesday after her death, something unusual began happening in our chapel during the deep hours of the night. I first noticed it while completing my evening rounds to ensure all candles were properly extinguished and the sacred vessels secured for the night. As I was locking the sacristy door, I heard what sounded like whispered conversation coming from the direction of the confessional booth. The sounds were too faint to understand, but the rhythm suggested someone speaking in the measured cadences of formal confession, the familiar pattern of admission, contrition, and request for absolution that I had heard countless times during my years of religious life. My initial assumption was that one of our sisters was making a private examination of conscience, perhaps preparing for Father McKenna's upcoming visit. Such individual prayer time was encouraged, though unusual at nearly midnight on a weekday. I decided not to investigate further, respecting the privacy that confession requires even during informal spiritual reflection. But as I walked toward the chapel entrance, the whispered voice became slightly more audible. What I heard made me pause in confusion and growing concern. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It has been 46 years since my last true confession." The voice was familiar, unmistakably Sister Magdalene's distinctive accent, shaped by decades of life in rural Kentucky before she entered religious life. But Sister Magdalene had been dead and buried for 3 weeks. What I was hearing was impossible. Yet the voice continued with the same urgent tone she had used during her final months of life. I have failed to complete the work God assigned to me. I made promises that I didn't keep. I left my duties unfinished when death came too soon. I approached the confessional booth cautiously, uncertain whether I was experiencing some kind of auditory hallucination brought on by grief and exhaustion. The chapel was dimly lit by the sanctuary lamp and a few vigil candles, creating pools of warm light separated by deep shadows. As I drew closer to the confessional, the whispered voice became clearer, more distinct. I need forgiveness for my failure, Father. I need permission to finish what I started. The work cannot remain undone. It will bring harm to my sisters if I don't complete it. The voice was coming from the penitent's side of the confessional booth, specifically from the compartment on the right that Sister Magdalene had always preferred during our formal confession services. But the booth had been locked since Father McKenna's last visit, and I carried the only key. No one could have entered without my knowledge. I stood outside the booth for several minutes, listening to what appeared to be a one-sided conversation with an invisible confessor. Sister Magdalene's voice continued in the same pattern, admitting failures, expressing remorse, pleading for guidance and absolution. But there were no responses from the priest's compartment, only the echo of her words in the enclosed wooden space. Finally, I decided to unlock the booth and investigate directly. Using my master key, I opened the central door that provided access to all 3 compartments. The priest's section was empty, as expected. The left penitent's compartment was also vacant. But when I opened the right compartment, I found Sister Magdalene kneeling on the prayer cushion, her hands folded in the traditional position of confession. She was exactly as I remembered her. The same weathered face, the same steel-gray hair visible beneath her black veil, the same intense expression of spiritual concentration. Her habit appeared freshly pressed, showing none of the soil stains that should have marked clothing worn by someone who had been buried in the earth for 3 weeks. When she looked up at me, her eyes held the same urgency that had marked her final months of life. "Sister Anne," she said in her familiar voice, "I'm so glad you're here. I've been trying to reach Father McKenna, but he doesn't seem to hear me. I need to make my confession properly before I can finish my work." I wanted to respond, to ask her about her death, about what she meant by unfinished work, about how she had managed to return from the grave. But my voice had abandoned me completely. I could only stare at this impossible apparition of someone I had helped bury 3 weeks earlier. "I made a promise to Mother Superior Margaret before she died," Sister Magdalene continued, her words tumbling out with desperate urgency. "She asked me to find the missing records from the 1940s, the documents that prove our legal claim to the eastern pasture. The developers have been pressuring us to sell, and without those papers, we might lose the land where our first sisters are buried." Mother Superior Margaret had died nearly 20 years ago, long before the current property disputes that Sister Magdalene mentioned. But as she spoke, I remembered conversations from recent community meetings, where Mother Superior Ruth had expressed concern about legal challenges to our land ownership, particularly regarding the cemetery section that contained our oldest graves. "I searched for months but couldn't find the documents before my heart gave out," Sister Magdalene said, her translucent hands gesturing toward the chapel altar. "They're hidden somewhere in the convent. Mother Margaret told me exactly where to look, but I died before I could retrieve them. My sisters need those papers, Sister Anne. The work must be finished." She reached toward me with one pale hand, and I felt a coldness that penetrated deeper than any winter wind. "Will you help me complete my promise? Will you search where I couldn't finish searching?" Before I could respond, she began to fade, becoming translucent and then invisible, though her voice continued for several more seconds. "The cornerstone, Sister Anne. Look in the cornerstone, where the old foundation meets the new. Mother Margaret hid them there during the expansion in 1943. I stood alone in the empty confessional booth, surrounded by the lingering scent of lavender and old roses that had always marked Sister Magdalene's presence among the living. The wooden compartment was cold as a tomb, and the prayer cushion bore the impression of knees that had rested there moments before. The next morning, I shared Sister Magdalene's message with Mother Superior Ruth, though I struggled to explain how I had received such specific information. Together, we examined the chapel's cornerstone, where the original building joined the wing added during the 1940s renovation. Behind a loose stone, we discovered a metal box containing property deeds, survey documents, and correspondence that clearly established the convent's legal ownership of the disputed land. The documents were exactly what our lawyers needed to resolve the property challenges that had been threatening our community's security for months. Mother Superior Ruth accepted the discovery as a providential answer to our prayers, though she asked no detailed questions about my midnight encounter in the confessional booth. I continue my evening rounds through the chapel, but I no longer hear whispered confessions from the sealed confessional booth. Sister Magdalene's urgent voice has fallen silent. Her earthly promise finally fulfilled through the collaboration between the living and the dead that sometimes emerges when love transcends the boundaries of mortal existence. Some work is too important to be interrupted by death, and some promises are too sacred to remain unfulfilled, simply because the one who made them has passed beyond the reach of ordinary communication. In helping Sister Magdalene complete her final duty to our community, I learned that the bonds of religious sisterhood can be stronger than the separation imposed by death itself. Cold has a way of lingering in sacred places, even after its source has been laid to rest. My name is Sister Joan, and I serve as chapel coordinator at Our Lady of Grace Convent in northern Maine, where winter temperatures regularly drop below zero and snow can accumulate for months at a time. Among my daily responsibilities is preparing the sanctuary for morning mass, which includes filling the holy water fonts, arranging fresh flowers when available, and ensuring our heating system maintains comfortable temperatures throughout the long services that mark our contemplative schedule. Our chapel was built in 1922 from local granite and oak timber, designed to withstand the harsh climate while providing a warm, welcoming space for prayer and worship. The building features radiant heating beneath the stone floors, supplemented by a modern furnace system that keeps interior temperatures steady even during the most severe weather. After 15 years of managing these systems, I've become familiar with every quirk and seasonal variation in our chapel's climate control. The holy water fonts are carved from Vermont marble and positioned near each entrance to the chapel, allowing sisters and visitors to bless themselves before entering the sanctuary. Each morning, I empty the fonts and refill them with fresh water that has been blessed by Father Sullivan during his weekly visits. The water remains at room temperature throughout the day, occasionally growing slightly warm from the chapel's radiant heating system during particularly cold weather. Sister Bernadette had been one of our most elderly residents before her death from pneumonia 6 weeks ago. At 89, she suffered from poor circulation that left her constantly cold, regardless of the season or indoor temperature. Even during our brief summer months, when other sisters would open windows to catch cooling breezes, Sister Bernadette would wrap herself in heavy shawls and sit close to our wood-burning stove in the common room. Her condition became more pronounced during her final winter, when she would arrive at morning mass wearing multiple layers of clothing and still shiver throughout the service. I had adjusted the chapel's heating system several times to accommodate her needs, raising temperatures to levels that left other sisters uncomfortably warm. But Sister Bernadette continued complaining about the cold, particularly during our dawn prayers when the building was just beginning to warm from the night's chill. She died on a Tuesday morning in early December, found in her cell by Sister Margaret, when she failed to appear for lauds. The coroner attributed her death to pneumonia, complicated by her advanced age, and poor circulation. We buried her in our small cemetery on a gray day, when the temperature hovered near zero, and the ground had to be thawed with heating equipment before the grave could be dug. The first unusual incident occurred 3 days after Sister Bernadette's funeral, during my routine morning preparation of the chapel. As I approached the holy water font near the main entrance, I discovered that the water had frozen solid overnight. Not just a thin film of ice on the surface, but completely frozen through a solid block of ice that filled the entire marble basin. This was puzzling, but not impossible to explain. Though our chapel was heated, the font was located near an exterior door where cold drafts might penetrate during particularly severe weather. I assumed the heating system had malfunctioned during the night, allowing temperatures to drop below freezing in certain areas of the building. But when I checked the thermostat and heating controls, everything appeared normal. The chapel temperature was a comfortable 72 degrees, exactly where I had set it the previous evening. The other holy water font, located only 15 feet away near the side entrance, contained normal liquid water at room temperature. Only the main font had frozen, and only the water it contained, the marble basin itself, showed no signs of frost or unusual cold. I melted the ice with warm water from the sacristy and refilled the font with fresh holy water, making a mental note to have the heating system inspected for localized problems. But the next morning, I found the same font frozen solid again, while everything else in the chapel remained at normal temperature. This pattern continued for a week. Each morning, the holy water in the main font would be completely frozen, requiring me to thaw and replace it before morning mass. The ice was always crystal clear and pure, forming in perfect conformity to the marble basin's curved interior. When I tested the temperature around the font with a thermometer, it registered the same 72 degrees as the rest of the chapel. Sister Margaret suggested that I contact a heating contractor to examine the building's systems, but the contractor found no problems with our equipment. He was particularly puzzled by the localized freezing, noting that such specific temperature variations were extremely unlikely in a well-insulated building with radiant heat distribution. It's almost like something is drawing the heat out of that particular area, he observed, studying the font with professional confusion. But there's no mechanical explanation for that kind of thermal behavior. After 2 weeks of daily ice removal, I decided to conduct a more systematic investigation. I placed thermometers at various heights around the font and recorded temperature readings at regular intervals throughout the night. The results were disturbing and inexplicable. Between midnight and 3 a.m., the temperature around the holy water font dropped dramatically from 72 degrees to below freezing, while the rest of the chapel remained warm and comfortable. The temperature change was limited to a roughly 6-foot radius around the font, creating a localized zone of intense cold that had no natural explanation. More unsettling was the timing of these temperature drops. According to my logs, the cold began each night at exactly 12:47 a.m., the precise time when Sister Bernadette had been found dead in her cell 6 weeks earlier. The temperature would gradually decrease over the next 2 hours, reach its minimum around 3 a.m., then slowly return to normal by dawn. I shared these findings with Mother Superior Catherine, though I hesitated to suggest any supernatural explanation for what I was observing. Mother Superior listened carefully to my data, examined the temperature logs, and spent several nights observing the phenomenon herself before reaching any conclusions. Sister Bernadette was always cold, she said finally, her voice thoughtful and sad. Perhaps death hasn't changed that fundamental aspect of her earthly experience. The cold zone around the holy water font persisted throughout the winter, requiring daily ice removal and creating a localized area of discomfort that other sisters began to notice and avoid. During morning mass, the pews nearest the main font remained empty, as sisters instinctively sought warmer areas of the chapel for prayer and worship. But something else began happening during those cold hours after midnight. Sisters who remained in the chapel for extended prayer periods reported seeing a figure kneeling near the font, An elderly woman in a heavy black shawl, her head bowed in what appeared to be intense prayer. The figure was translucent and wavering, like heat shimmer in reverse, visible primarily in peripheral vision. Sister Dorothy, who often stayed late to complete the rosary prayers for our deceased sisters, described seeing Sister Bernadette kneeling beside the font during the coldest hours of the night. She looked exactly as she did during her final months, Sister Dorothy reported, wrapped in that thick shawl she always wore, shivering, even in death. I began staying in the chapel during the midnight hours, hoping to observe this apparition myself. On the third night of my vigil, I saw her clearly, Sister Bernadette, kneeling on the cold stone floor beside the holy water font, her lips moving in silent prayer, her entire form surrounded by the visible vapor of her breath in the supernatural cold that accompanied her presence. She appeared to be blessing herself repeatedly with the holy water, her thin fingers dipping into the font and making the sign of the cross with mechanical precision. But each time her hand touched the water, ice crystals formed instantly, spreading outward from the point of contact until the entire basin froze solid. I tried to approach her, to offer some word of comfort or assistance, but as I moved closer, the cold became unbearable, not just physical cold, but a spiritual chill that seemed to penetrate my soul and leave me gasping for breath. Sister Bernadette looked up at me with eyes that held infinite sadness and confusion, as if she couldn't understand why death hadn't brought the warmth she had sought throughout her final years of life. "So cold," she whispered, her voice like wind through winter branches, "still so very cold." By spring, the nightly freezing had stopped, though the holy water font remained several degrees cooler than the surrounding chapel throughout the warmer months. Sister Bernadette's nocturnal visits became less frequent, though sisters still occasionally reported seeing her kneeling in prayer during the coldest nights of winter. I continue to fill the holy water fonts each morning, but I've learned to check the main font first during winter months, keeping a supply of warm water ready for thawing when Sister Bernadette's presence turns sacred water into ice. Some needs, it seems, persist beyond death, and for someone who spent her final years desperately seeking warmth in a cold world, the transition to eternal rest may require more time than any of us can fully understand. The cold she carried in life has become the cold she brings in death, transforming even blessed water into frozen reminders that some suffering transcends the boundaries between earthly existence and whatever lies beyond the veil of mortal experience. Some melodies linger in the walls long after their singers have fallen silent. My name is Sister Patricia, and I recently transferred to St. Brigid's Convent in the mountains of Colorado, where I was assigned to Cell 7 in the East Wing dormitory. The cell had been vacant for 3 months, following the death of its previous occupant, Sister Dorothy, who had lived there for 18 years before succumbing to complications from diabetes. As the newest arrival to our community of 28 sisters, I was grateful for any accommodation, though several older sisters made cryptic comments about the room's particular history without elaborating on what they meant. Our dormitory consists of 12 small cells arranged along a narrow corridor, each furnished with a single bed, a writing desk, a wooden chair, and a small wardrobe for personal belongings. The walls are constructed from local pine logs, chinked with traditional mortar that has settled and dried over the decades since the building's construction in 1938. The simple architecture creates an atmosphere of contemplative austerity, while providing adequate privacy for individual prayer and study. Cell 7 is located at the end of the corridor, with Cell 6 to its left, and Cell 8 standing empty due to our community's gradual reduction in numbers over recent years. The isolation suited my preference for quiet reflection, and I settled quickly into the rhythm of convent life, participating in our daily schedule of prayer, work, and communal meals with genuine enthusiasm for this new chapter in my religious vocation. Sister Dorothy had been known throughout the community for her beautiful singing voice and her extensive knowledge of traditional hymns. During her 43 years of religious life, she had served as our choir director and taught younger sisters the complex harmonies that marked our most solemn liturgical celebrations. Even during her final illness, when diabetes had severely limited her mobility and energy, she continued humming familiar melodies during quiet moments, filling the infirmary with gentle music that comforted both patients and caregivers. Her death came peacefully during afternoon prayer, when she simply stopped responding during the recitation of the rosary and slipped away without struggle or apparent distress. We buried her in our small cemetery with a funeral mass that featured many of the hymns she had taught us over the decades, creating a musical memorial that seemed to capture her essential contribution to our community's spiritual life. For the first week in Cell 7, everything proceeded normally. I established my personal prayer schedule, arranged my few possessions according to the room's simple layout, and began participating in the work rotations that maintained our convent's daily operations. The cell was quiet and comfortable, with a single window facing east toward the mountains and sufficient space for the solitary reflection that forms the foundation of contemplative religious life. But during my second week, I began noticing unusual sounds coming through the walls during the late evening hours. It started as barely audible humming, so faint that I initially assumed it was coming from one of the occupied cells further down the corridor. The melody was familiar, something from our evening prayer repertoire, carried in a thin but true voice that seemed to emanate from the wall separating Cell 7 from Cell 6. Since Cell 6 had been empty for over a year, I assumed the sound was traveling from Cell 5, where Sister Catherine lived, perhaps reflecting off the corridor walls, in a way that made it seem closer than it actually was. The humming occurred every night around 10:30, just after our formal evening prayers had concluded, and most sisters had retired to their cells for private devotions before sleep. The melodies were always sacred traditional hymns, like "Holy God, we praise thy name," or "Come, Holy Ghost," sung with the kind of reverent attention that suggested deep familiarity and genuine devotion. After several nights of this pattern, I mentioned the late evening music to Sister Catherine during our morning work period. But Sister Catherine looked puzzled and insisted she never sang or hummed after evening prayers, preferring to conclude each day with silent reflection and reading from her breviary. "Perhaps it's Sister Margaret in Cell 4, she suggested. "She sometimes practices hymns for Sunday Mass when she thinks no one can hear her." But when I discreetly inquired with Sister Margaret, she also denied any late evening singing. In fact, when I described the timing and location of the sounds I was hearing, both sisters exchanged meaningful glances that suggested they knew something they weren't willing to discuss openly. The humming continued for another week, becoming gradually more distinct and easier to identify. The voice carried considerable skill and experience, moving through complex harmonies with the confidence of someone who had sung these melodies thousands of times. But there was also something wistful about the sound, as if the singer was remembering rather than actively performing, recalling musical experiences from a time that had passed beyond recovery. On my third Sunday in Cell 7, I decided to investigate more directly. When the familiar humming began at 10:30, I quietly left my cell and walked down the corridor, trying to determine the exact source of the sound. But as I moved away from Cell 7, the humming became fainter rather than clearer, suggesting that the music was indeed coming from somewhere very close to my room. I returned to Cell 7 and listened more carefully, pressing my ear against the wall that separated my room from the empty Cell 6. The humming was definitely coming from that direction, not from further down the corridor, but from the vacant room next door. The voice was clear and distinct, carrying through the thin pine walls with remarkable clarity. More unsettling was my growing recognition of the singer's vocal characteristics. The tone, the phrasing, the particular way certain notes were sustained all reminded me strongly of recordings I had heard of Sister Dorothy's voice during community celebrations and liturgical services. But Sister Dorothy had been dead for 4 months, and Cell 6 had been thoroughly cleaned and inspected before being sealed for future renovations. The next night, I positioned myself beside the shared wall and listened with complete attention as the familiar humming began precisely at 10:30. This time, I was certain the voice was definitely Sister Dorothy's, carrying the same distinctive vibrato and careful attention to musical phrasing that had marked her decades of service as our choir director. The melody was Veni Creator Spiritus, one of her favorite hymns, hummed with the slow, meditative pace she had always used during private prayer. But as the music continued, I began to notice something that made my hands tremble and my heart race with inexplicable dread. The humming was gradually becoming more sorrowful, transforming from peaceful meditation into something that sounded increasingly distressed. The familiar melody remained intact, but the emotional content was shifting toward profound sadness, as if the singer was struggling with some unresolved grief or regret that death hadn't been able to heal. The music finally stopped, as it did every night, but this time it was followed by whispered words that came through the wall with startling clarity. "Forgive me, Mother, for I cannot rest." The voice was unmistakably Sister Dorothy's, though it carried a quality of desperation I had never heard in the recordings of her living performances. The words were repeated 3 times, always with the same pleading tone, before silence returned to the empty cell next door. I lay awake for hours that night, trying to understand what I had heard and what it might mean. Sister Dorothy had been universally beloved within our community, known for her gentle kindness and unwavering dedication to both her musical ministry and her religious vows. What possible transgression could be troubling her spirit so deeply that death itself couldn't provide the peace she sought? The next morning, I approached Mother Superior Agnes with my concerns, though I struggled to find words that wouldn't make me sound like someone suffering from nervous exhaustion or religious hysteria. Mother Superior listened patiently to my account, asked several careful questions about the timing and content of what I had heard, then sat in thoughtful silence for several minutes before responding. "Sister Dorothy carried a burden during her final years," she said finally, "something she felt she had never properly confessed or resolved. She mentioned it several times during her last illness, but she could never bring herself to speak about it specifically, even during the sacrament of final rites." She paused, studying my face with the careful attention that comes from decades of pastoral responsibility. "Perhaps she is seeking the forgiveness she was unable to request during her earthly life. Perhaps your presence in Cell 7 provides an opportunity for her to complete something that was left unfinished." That night, I waited for the familiar humming to begin, but instead of simply listening, I decided to respond. When Sister Dorothy's voice came through the wall at 10:30, I quietly began humming the harmony part to Veni Creator Spiritus, joining my voice to hers in the musical collaboration that had been impossible during her lifetime. The effect was immediate and profound. Sister Dorothy's humming became stronger, more confident, returning to the peaceful tone I remembered from her recorded performances. We sang together for nearly an hour, invisible partners, separated by death and a thin pine wall, but united in the sacred music that had been her greatest gift to our community. When the music finally ended, her whispered prayer came through the wall one final time. "Thank you, Sister. Now I can rest." I never heard Sister Dorothy's voice again, though Cell 6 remains empty and will likely stay that way for the foreseeable future. But sometimes, during our evening hymns in the chapel, I catch faint echoes of harmonies that seem to come from somewhere beyond our visible choir, adding richness and depth to our music in ways that remind me of her continuing presence among us. Some voices are too beautiful to be silenced by death, and some musical gifts are too precious to be limited by the boundaries between earthly performance and eternal song. In learning to sing with Sister Dorothy across the veil that separates the living from the dead, I discovered that harmony can exist in dimensions far more mysterious than any earthly choir could ever achieve. Faith, it seems, recognizes no boundaries between the living and the dead. My name is Sister Elizabeth, and I serve as prayer coordinator at Sacred Heart of Mary Convent in the rolling hills of Virginia, where our community of 31 sisters maintains a schedule of contemplative worship that begins each day at 5:30 a.m. with morning lauds. As prayer coordinator, I arrive in the chapel 15 minutes early to prepare the sanctuary, light the candles, and ensure everything is ready for our communal devotions that mark the transition from night to the active day ahead. Our chapel is a simple but beautiful space, with 12 oak pews arranged in 2 columns, facing a modest altar adorned with fresh flowers when available, and always graced by the warm light of our sanctuary lamp. The morning prayer service follows the traditional structure of psalms, readings, and intercessions that has sustained monastic communities for centuries, creating a rhythm of worship that connects our daily experience to the eternal patterns of divine praise. Sister Frances had been one of our most faithful participants in morning prayer before her peaceful death in her sleep 2 months ago. At 76, she had maintained perfect attendance at our dawn services for over 15 years, arriving early and remaining after the formal conclusion to spend additional time in private prayer before the Blessed Sacrament. Her dedication was remarkable, even within our contemplative community, where regular participation in communal prayer forms the foundation of religious life. She died on a Wednesday night in early September, found by Sister Margaret when she failed to appear for morning prayer, the first time in anyone's memory that Sister Frances had missed our dawn service without being confined to the infirmary. The coroner attributed her death to heart failure during sleep, noting that she appeared to have died peacefully without struggle or distress. We buried her in our small cemetery after a funeral mass that emphasized her decades of faithful prayer and her quiet but profound influence on our community's spiritual life. For the first week after Sister Frances's funeral, our morning prayer services proceeded normally, though her absence created a noticeable gap in our familiar rhythm of communal worship. The pew where she had sat for 15 years remained empty, and several sisters commented on how different the chapel felt without her gentle presence, anchoring our collective devotions from her traditional spot in the front row. But during the second week after her death, I began noticing something unusual during my early morning preparations of the sanctuary. Sister Frances was already in the chapel when I arrived each morning, sitting in her customary pew with her prayer book open and her rosary resting in her lap. She appeared exactly as she had during life, the same weathered face marked by decades of prayer and contemplation, the same black habit she had worn for over 50 years of religious life, the same peaceful expression of someone completely absorbed in conversation with God. At first, I assumed my eyes were playing tricks on me in the dim candlelight, or that one of our other early rising sisters had taken Sister Frances's usual place out of respect for her memory. But when I looked more carefully, the figure was unmistakably Sister Frances herself. Not a similar-looking sister, but the same person I had seen daily for the 8 years since my arrival at Sacred Heart of Mary. When the other sisters began arriving for morning prayer, they filed into their usual pews without acknowledging Sister Frances's presence. Sister Margaret, who had discovered her body and was deeply grieved by her death, walked directly past Sister Frances's pew without any sign of recognition. Sister Dorothy, who had been Sister Frances's closest friend during their final years, took her usual place 2 rows behind, without glancing toward the spot where Sister Frances sat, in apparent prayer. During the service itself, Sister Frances participated fully in our communal prayers. Her lips moved in perfect synchronization with our recitation of the Psalms. She stood and sat at the appropriate moments, and her voice seemed to blend with our collective responses during the traditional exchanges between prayer leader and community. But when I listened carefully, trying to isolate her voice from our group recitation, I heard only the familiar voices of our 30 living sisters. Sister Frances's participation was somehow both visible and inaudible. This pattern continued for several weeks. Each morning, I would find Sister Frances already in her pew when I arrived to prepare the sanctuary. She would remain throughout our entire prayer service, participating with the same devotion she had shown during life, but apparently invisible to every sister except myself. When the formal prayers concluded, she would linger in the chapel for additional private devotion, exactly as she had done for 15 years before her death. I began experimenting with different approaches to this phenomenon, trying to understand whether I was experiencing some kind of grief-induced hallucination or witnessing something genuinely supernatural. I positioned myself at various locations in the chapel, observed Sister Frances from different angles, and even attempted to photograph her during morning prayer using a small camera I borrowed from our office supplies. The results were disturbing and inconclusive. From every vantage point, Sister Frances appeared solid and real, participating normally in our prayer services. But the photographs showed only empty space, where she appeared to be sitting, no figure, no shadow, no indication that anyone occupied her customary pew. Yet my own eyes continued to see her clearly during every morning service. After a month of these observations, I decided to approach Mother Superior Catherine with my concerns. I had postponed this conversation partly from fear that I might be suffering from some kind of psychological breakdown, and partly from reluctance to discuss something that seemed both sacred and inexplicable, in ways that defied rational explanation. Mother Superior listened carefully to my account, asked several thoughtful questions about the timing and consistency of Sister Frances's apparent appearances, then requested that I continue my observations for another week before taking any action. Her response suggested that my experience might not be entirely unprecedented within our community's history. Sister Frances spent over 50 years in faithful prayer within these walls. Mother Superior said thoughtfully, "Perhaps death is simply a transition rather than a termination of her conversation with God. If she continues to find peace in our morning prayers, and if her presence brings no disturbance to our community, then perhaps we should simply accept this as another manifestation of the mystery that surrounds all religious life." The following Sunday, during a particularly beautiful morning prayer service, when autumn sunlight filled the chapel through our eastern windows, something remarkable happened. As we concluded our traditional closing hymn, Sister Frances turned in her pew and looked directly at me with the gentle smile I remembered from countless shared mornings of prayer. She mouthed the words, "Thank you, Sister Elizabeth," without making any sound, then bowed her head in a final prayer, before gradually fading from view, like morning mist dissolving in sunlight. I never saw her again during our morning services, though her pew somehow retained a sense of warmth and presence that suggested her spiritual participation might continue in ways invisible to earthly observation. Several weeks later, while organizing Sister Frances's personal effects for distribution to family members, I discovered a prayer journal she had maintained during her final years. The last entry, written the day before her death, included a passage that shed light on her posthumous appearances in our chapel. "I pray that death will not separate me from the morning praise that has sustained my soul for so many years. If it is God's will, may I continue to lift my voice with my sisters in the eternal conversation that connects earth to heaven through the simple offering of communal prayer." I shared this passage with Mother Superior Catherine, who read it with the thoughtful attention of someone who had witnessed many mysteries during her decades of religious leadership. "Perhaps Sister Frances received exactly what she prayed for," she observed. "Perhaps her faithful participation in our morning prayers continues in dimensions we cannot fully perceive or understand." I continue serving as prayer coordinator, arriving each morning 15 minutes early to prepare our chapel for the dawn service that marks the beginning of each contemplative day. Though I no longer see Sister Frances in her customary pew, I sometimes sense a presence that suggests her spiritual participation in our collective worship, a reminder that the community of prayer extends beyond the boundaries of earthly life, into realms where death becomes simply another form of faithful response to the divine invitation that calls all souls to eternal praise. Our morning prayers continue with the same rhythm and devotion that sustained Sister Frances for 15 years. and perhaps sustain her still in ways that transcend the limitations of physical presence while honoring the eternal nature of authentic worship offered in spirit and truth. Music, once learned by faithful hands, echoes beyond the silence of death. My name is Sister Cecilia, and I have served as organist at Our Lady of the Mountains Convent for 7 years, providing musical accompaniment for our daily masses and special liturgical celebrations throughout the church calendar. The responsibility came to me somewhat unexpectedly when our longtime organist, Sister Wilhelmina, died suddenly of a stroke while practicing for Easter services last spring. Though my musical training was limited compared to her 42 years of accomplished performance, I accepted the role with the understanding that I would learn and improve through dedicated practice and the grace that sustains all forms of service to our contemplative community. Our organ is a magnificent Cassavant instrument, installed in 1954 with 3 manual keyboards and a full range of stops that can fill our stone chapel with sound ranging from whispered sweetness to triumphant declarations of praise. Sister Wilhelmina had mastered every aspect of this complex instrument, coaxing from it musical interpretations that transformed our simple liturgies into profound experiences of worship that lingered in memory long after the final notes had faded into silence. The organ bench where I now sit each morning still bears the subtle impressions left by Sister Wilhelmina's decades of faithful practice. The music rack holds penciled annotations in her careful handwriting tempo markings, registration suggestions, and personal reminders that guided her through the vast repertoire she had accumulated during her religious life. Though I've tried to organize this music according to my own needs, I find myself reluctant to erase her notations, which seem like whispered advice from a master to an apprentice who never had the opportunity to learn directly from such accomplished hands. Sister Wilhelmina had been known throughout our region for her extraordinary musical abilities. Before entering religious life, she had studied organ performance at the New England Conservatory and served as principal organist at several prominent churches in Boston. Her decision to join our contemplative community surprised many who knew her professional potential, but she always insisted that music served its highest purpose when offered in praise of God within the context of daily liturgical prayer. During her 4 decades at Our Lady of the Mountains, Sister Wilhelmina had developed a distinctive style of organ playing that combined technical precision with profound spiritual insight. Her improvisations during communion were particularly memorable, flowing musical conversations that seemed to emerge spontaneously from her prayer, rather than from any written score. She could create harmonies and melodic variations that enhanced familiar hymns without overwhelming them, adding layers of beauty that supported congregational singing while creating space for individual reflection and worship. Her death came without warning during a Wednesday evening practice session, when Sister Margaret found her collapsed at the organ bench with her hands still resting on the keys. The coroner determined that she had died instantly from a massive stroke, apparently while playing through the complex Bach prelude she had planned for Easter morning. We buried her in our small cemetery after a funeral mass that featured many of the musical arrangements she had created during her years of service. Though my own performance fell far short of the standard she had maintained throughout her religious life. For the first several months after assuming her position, I struggled with the technical demands of our liturgical music, particularly during our more elaborate celebrations that required complex registrations and difficult pedal work. My playing was adequate but uninspired, lacking the fluidity and spiritual depth that had marked Sister Wilhelmina's musical ministry. Several sisters gently suggested that I consider requesting musical assistance from organists in the nearby town, though I was determined to develop the skills necessary to serve our community's worship needs independently. The first unusual incident occurred during Mass on the Feast of St. Cecilia in late November. I was playing the offertory hymn, "How Great Thou Art," when I began to hear what sounded like a second organ, providing harmonic accompaniment to my melody line. The additional voice was subtle but distinct, a bass line that perfectly complemented my treble melody, played with a sophistication that was far beyond my own musical abilities. At first, I assumed this was some kind of acoustic phenomenon, perhaps an echo effect created by the stone architecture of our chapel during certain weather conditions. But as I continued playing, the harmonic accompaniment became more elaborate, adding inner voices and counter melodies that transformed the simple hymn into a rich musical tapestry that filled the chapel with extraordinary beauty. I tested this phenomenon by deliberately stopping my playing mid-phrase. The harmonic accompaniment continued for several measures before gradually fading away, as if invisible hands were completing the musical thought I had abandoned. The style was unmistakably Sister Wilhelmina's, the same sophisticated voice leading and harmonic language that had characterized her playing during the decades when I had listened to her from the congregation. This pattern repeated during subsequent masses, though not consistently. The invisible accompaniment appeared primarily during the hymns that Sister Wilhelmina had arranged with special care pieces where she had developed distinctive harmonic treatments that enhanced the theological content through musical interpretation. During these moments, my simple melody lines would be joined by the complex inner voices and bass lines that I recognized from memory as Sister Wilhelmina's signature approaches to familiar liturgical music. The other sisters began commenting on the improved quality of our musical worship, noting that the organ seemed to be producing richer, more complex sounds than they had heard since Sister Wilhelmina's death. Sister Margaret, who sat closest to the organ during Mass, mentioned that she sometimes heard musical lines that seemed to come from different directions within the chapel, as if multiple organists were collaborating on a single performance. The music has returned to the standard Sister Wilhelmina maintained, Mother Superior observed during our monthly conference. Your playing has improved dramatically, Sister Cecilia. The additional practice time must be developing your musical abilities more quickly than we had hoped. But I knew that my own abilities remained limited to basic melody lines and simple accompaniments. The sophisticated musical textures that were emerging during our liturgies came from a source beyond my current skill level, though I hesitated to discuss this supernatural possibility with Mother Superior or the other sisters. During Advent, the invisible accompaniment became more frequent and more elaborate. Sister Wilhelmina's harmonic voice would join my playing during the opening hymn, weave counter melodies through the psalm responses, and create complex improvisational bridges between sections of the Mass that demonstrated musical understanding far beyond anything I could achieve independently. On Christmas Eve, during our midnight Mass, the collaboration reached its most profound expression. As I began the opening hymn, "O come all ye faithful," Sister Wilhelmina's invisible hands joined mine in a musical celebration that transformed our simple chapel into a cathedral of sound. The organ responded with colors and textures I had never been able to coax from its pipes, creating a musical proclamation of joy that seemed to transcend earthly limitations. During the communion meditation, when I typically struggled with improvisation, the organ seemed to play itself flowing melodies and harmonies that emerged without conscious direction from my own hands, as if Sister Wilhelmina was guiding my fingers across keys and pedals with the same gentle instruction she might have provided during a living music lesson. The most remarkable moment came during the final hymn, when I felt a presence beside me on the organ bench, not visible, but unmistakably real. The sensation was of someone sitting close enough to share the bench, their hands moving across the manual keyboards while I concentrated on the pedal work that had always given me difficulty. "Thank you, Sister Cecilia," I heard in a whisper that seemed to come from the organ pipes themselves, rather than from any earthly voice. "The music must continue. It is too important to let my death interrupt the praise that sustains our community's prayer." Since that Christmas Eve Mass, the invisible accompaniment has become a regular part of our liturgical music, though it appears only during the most sacred moments of our worship, when the deepest spiritual truths require musical expression that transcends ordinary human ability. I continue serving as organist for our daily Masses, but I no longer consider myself the sole musician responsible for our community's liturgical music. Sister Wilhelmina's presence at the organ bench has become a source of comfort rather than mystery. A reminder that death cannot interrupt the faithful service that connects earthly worship to the eternal song of praise that sustains all creation. The music we create together transcends anything I could achieve independently, transforming our simple chapel into a sacred space where the boundary between earthly and heavenly worship becomes permeable through the universal language of music offered in faithful service to the divine mystery that calls all souls to sing. Some duties transcend death, continuing with the same faithful precision that marked them in life. My name is Sister Helen, and I serve as head of housekeeping at St. Joseph's Convent in rural Ohio, where I manage the laundry, cleaning schedules, and general maintenance for our community of 26 sisters. The work requires careful attention to detail and systematic organization, particularly during our Monday laundry processing, when each sister's weekly washing must be sorted, cleaned, and returned according to our established routines that ensure everyone receives their personal items in good condition and timely fashion. Our laundry facility occupies the basement level of the main convent building, with industrial washing machines and dryers installed during the renovation project of 1987. The space also includes large sorting tables, drying racks for delicate items, and storage areas for linens and cleaning supplies. Despite the utilitarian nature of the work, I've always found satisfaction in maintaining the cleanliness and order that supports our community's daily life and allows our sisters to focus on prayer and contemplation without concern for domestic details. Each sister is responsible for placing her weekly laundry in designated baskets located outside her cell door every Sunday evening. Monday morning, I collect these baskets and transport them to the basement facility where items are sorted by fabric type, stain treatment requirements, and washing temperature needs. The process typically requires the entire day, with clothes returned to individual cells by Tuesday morning in time for the week's activities and prayer schedules. Our community follows traditional practices regarding religious habits, with each sister owning 2 identical black garments that allow for weekly washing while maintaining appropriate dress during all community activities. The habits are simple but well-made, constructed from durable wool fabric that withstands repeated washing and maintains its appearance through years of daily wear. Most sisters have used the same habits for decades, with careful mending and maintenance extending their useful life far beyond what might be expected from ordinary clothing. The unusual pattern began 3 months ago, during what should have been a routine Monday laundry processing. As I sorted through the weekly collection of habits, linens, and personal items, I discovered an extra habit that didn't correspond to any of our current residents. The garment was identical to our standard design, black wool fabric, traditional cut, appropriate length, but it bore subtle differences that suggested it belonged to an earlier era of our community's history. The fabric was heavier than our modern habits, with a weave pattern that indicated hand looming rather than machine production. The stitching was entirely by hand, with seam work that demonstrated the kind of careful attention to detail that characterized religious garments from decades past, when sisters often made their own clothes rather than purchasing standardized items from religious supply companies. More puzzling was the condition of this mysterious habit. Despite its apparent age, the fabric showed no signs of wear, fading, or deterioration. It was perfectly clean, as if it had just been washed and carefully pressed, and it was folded with military precision in a style that none of our current sisters employed for their personal laundry preparation. I checked our community roster carefully, counting each sister's submitted items against the garments I had collected for washing. The numbers didn't match. I had 27 habits when our community included only 26 sisters. The extra habit clearly belonged somewhere within our laundry system, but its origin remained completely mysterious. My first assumption was that one of our sisters had discovered an old habit in her cell and decided to have it cleaned before storing it with our historical garments collection. But when I inquired during our weekly community meeting, no one acknowledged responsibility for the extra item. Sister Margaret, who managed our historical archives, confirmed that she hadn't requested any cleaning of vintage religious clothing. I decided to wash the mysterious habit along with the regular weekly items, assuming that someone would eventually claim it or explain its presence in our laundry collection. The garment processed normally through our washing and drying cycles, though I noticed that it seemed to require less time than our modern habits to achieve complete cleanliness, as if the fabric had some natural resistance to staining or soiling. The following Monday, the same phenomenon occurred. Among the 26 habits submitted by our current community members, I found an identical extra garment, perfectly clean, precisely folded, and bearing the same characteristics of hand-woven fabric and meticulous construction that had marked the previous week's mysterious addition to our laundry collection. This pattern continued for several weeks, with the extra habit appearing every Monday morning, despite my careful attention to tracking all items through our weekly processing cycle. The garment was always in the same condition, spotlessly clean, expertly folded, and showing no signs of wear, despite its apparent age and the repeated washing cycles I had subjected it to during my attempts to understand its origin. After a month of this weekly mystery, I decided to research our convent's historical records, hoping to find some explanation for the appearance of vintage religious clothing in our modern laundry system. In the archives maintained by Sister Margaret, I discovered detailed inventory lists from our community's earlier decades, including descriptions of habits owned by sisters who had died during the 1940s and 50s. One entry caught my attention immediately. Sister Constance Mary, 2 habits, hand-woven wool, died of pneumonia, February 12, 1943. The description matched perfectly with the mysterious garment that had been appearing in our weekly laundry, including specific details about the fabric, weight, and construction methods that were characteristic of that historical period. Sister Constance had served as head of housekeeping for 18 years before her death, managing the same domestic responsibilities that I now handled for our contemporary community. According to the records, she had been known for her exceptional attention to detail and her insistence that all community laundry be processed with systematic precision that ensured proper care for every sister's personal belongings. The historical accounts described Sister Constance as someone who took profound satisfaction in maintaining the cleanliness and order that supported contemplative religious life. Even during her final illness, she had continued supervising laundry operations from her infirmary bed, providing detailed instructions for handling delicate items, and ensuring that her replacement understood the complex scheduling required to process all community washing efficiently. Armed with this information, I approached Mother Superior with my observations about the weekly appearance of what appeared to be Sister Constance's habit in our current laundry collection. Mother Superior listened carefully to my account, examined the mysterious garment I had saved from the previous week's washing, and spent considerable time reviewing the historical records I had discovered in our archives. Sister Constance was devoted to her housekeeping duties, Mother Superior observed thoughtfully. According to these records, her final words were a request that someone continue maintaining the laundry standards she had established during her years of service. Perhaps death hasn't released her from responsibilities she considered too important to abandon. The next Monday morning, I decided to approach the phenomenon with the respect due to someone who might be continuing her faithful service beyond the boundaries of earthly life. Instead of treating the extra habit as an unexplained mystery, I processed it with the same careful attention I gave to all community laundry, washing it gently and folding it according to the precise standards that Sister Constance had apparently maintained throughout her religious life. As I worked with the garment, I felt a subtle presence in the laundry room, not frightening, but somehow approving, as if my careful handling of Sister Constance's habit met with satisfaction from someone who understood the spiritual importance of maintaining domestic order within contemplative religious communities. When I finished processing the weekly laundry, I placed Sister Constance's habit in a special storage area with a small note expressing gratitude for her continued dedication to the housekeeping standards that support our community's prayer and contemplation. The following Monday, the habit appeared again in our collection, but this time it was accompanied by what appeared to be a small piece of paper bearing a single word written in faded pencil: gratitude. The weekly appearance of Sister Constance's habit has become an accepted part of our laundry routine, though I'm the only sister who handles this particular aspect of our domestic operations. I continue processing her garment with the same attention to detail that she apparently maintained during her earthly service, recognizing that some forms of faithful duty transcend the limitations of mortal life. Each Monday, as I sort through our community's weekly washing, I'm reminded that the simple tasks that sustain religious life, cooking, cleaning, maintenance, and laundry, are themselves forms of prayer and service that connect earthly work to eternal purpose. Sister Constance's posthumous participation in our housekeeping duties serves as a gentle reminder that death doesn't necessarily interrupt the faithful service that finds sacred meaning in ordinary work offered with extraordinary love. Some books demand readers long after their earthly students have graduated to higher forms of learning. My name is Sister Grace, and I serve as librarian at Our Lady of Wisdom Convent in the mountains of New Hampshire, where I maintain our collection of theological texts, spiritual writings, and historical documents that support our community's contemplative study and prayer. The library occupies the entire second floor of our oldest building, with tall windows facing east toward the mountains, and reading alcoves arranged throughout the space to provide quiet areas for individual research and reflection. Our collection includes over 8,000 volumes accumulated during the convent's 120-year history, ranging from contemporary theological scholarship to rare manuscripts donated by benefactors who understood the importance of preserving religious texts for future generations of contemplative scholars. The library serves not only our own community of 32 sisters, but also visiting researchers and retreat participants who come seeking resources for their spiritual studies and academic projects. During my 15 years as librarian, I've developed intimate familiarity with every section of our collection, every reading space, and every subtle variation in the building's daily rhythms of light, sound, and activity. The library requires constant attention, cataloging new acquisitions, maintaining proper environmental conditions for preservation of older texts, and ensuring that our resources remain accessible to everyone who might benefit from their scholarly and spiritual content. Sister Agatha had been our previous librarian for 38 years, before her death from complications of advanced age 6 months ago. At 87, she had continued working until her final week, arriving each morning at 7 o'clock to unlock the library doors and remaining until evening prayers to ensure that all books were properly shelved and the reading areas prepared for the next day's activities. Her dedication to scholarly precision and careful preservation of our collection had earned respect throughout the regional community of religious libraries and theological institutions. She died peacefully in her sleep on a Tuesday night in early October, found the next morning by Sister Margaret when she failed to appear for morning prayer. We buried her in our small cemetery after a funeral mass that emphasized her decades of faithful scholarship and her quiet but profound influence on countless sisters who had benefited from her guidance in their theological studies and spiritual reading. The library felt profoundly different after Sister Agatha's death, not just because of her physical absence, but because the space seemed somehow incomplete without her gentle presence moving between the reading alcoves and book stacks that had been her primary home for nearly 4 decades. I tried to maintain the standards she had established, but I was constantly aware of falling short of the scholarly expertise and institutional memory that she had brought to every aspect of library administration. For the first month after assuming full responsibility for our collection, I worked late most evenings, trying to familiarize myself with Sister Agatha's complex cataloging systems and the particular needs of our most serious theological researchers. These extended hours often kept me in the library until well after evening prayers, working by lamplight in the peaceful silence that settled over the building once our community had retired to their cells for private prayer and rest. It was during one of these late evening work sessions that I first noticed the figure in the corner reading alcove. She appeared to be an elderly nun, though the candlelight made it difficult to see her clearly from my position at the main circulation desk. Her posture suggested someone completely absorbed in serious reading, head bowed over an open book, one hand turning pages with careful precision, the other holding what appeared to be a magnifying glass for examining fine print or difficult passages. My initial assumption was that one of our older sisters had decided to extend her study time beyond our normal library hours, perhaps working on a research project that required evening concentration. Such dedication wasn't unusual within our contemplative community, where scholarly pursuits often continued well into the night. For sisters pursuing advanced theological studies or preparing presentations for academic conferences. But as I continued my own cataloging work, I began to notice something unusual about the figure in the corner alcove. She never moved from her reading position, never paused to rest her eyes or stretch tired muscles, never shifted her weight or adjusted her sitting position in ways that would be natural during extended periods of concentrated study. More puzzling was her apparent invisibility to other sisters who occasionally visited the library during evening hours. Sister Dorothy, who often retrieved books for bedtime spiritual reading, walked directly past the occupied alcove without acknowledging the presence of another person in the reading area. Sister Catherine, who sometimes used our reference materials for correspondence with other contemplative communities, settled at a nearby table without any indication that she noticed someone studying in the corner. After several nights of observing this pattern, I decided to approach the mysterious reader directly. During a quiet moment, when no other sisters were present in the library, I walked slowly toward the corner alcove, where the figure continued her apparently tireless study. As I drew closer, I could see more details of her appearance: gray hair visible beneath a black veil, weathered hands holding a large book open to what appeared to be Old Testament text, and the familiar black habit worn by our community for over a century. When I was close enough to speak, without disturbing other readers, I cleared my throat softly and said, "Excuse me, sister. The library will be closing soon for evening prayers." The figure looked up from her book, and I found myself staring into the familiar face of Sister Agatha, the same intelligent eyes, the same gentle expression of someone perpetually engaged with fascinating ideas, the same slight smile that had marked her interactions with students and researchers throughout her decades of library service. "Just finishing this passage, Sister Grace," she said, in her unmistakable voice, though it seemed to come from very far away despite our physical proximity. Ecclesiastes has always required careful attention. The wisdom literature demands patience that most readers don't possess in our hurried age. I wanted to respond, to ask her about her death, about her return to the library, about what she was studying with such intense concentration. But as I opened my mouth to speak, she had already returned her attention to the open book, her finger tracing lines of text with the same scholarly precision she had maintained during her earthly life. When I looked at the book more closely, I could see that it was our rare Latin Vulgate Bible, open to the book of Ecclesiastes. The pages were illuminated by candlelight that seemed to come from no visible source, creating a warm circle of golden light that surrounded Sister Agatha's reading area without extending to the surrounding alcove space. I remained standing beside her reading chair for several minutes, watching as she continued through the familiar passages about vanity and wisdom, time and eternity, The search for meaning in a world where all earthly pursuits eventually prove temporary. Her lips moved silently as she read, occasionally pausing to consider particularly complex theological implications of the ancient text. When she reached the end of the chapter, Sister Agatha closed the Bible gently and looked up at me with the same expression of patient instruction that had characterized her guidance of countless students during her years of active library service. "The library must continue, Sister Grace," she said softly. "The books need readers, and the readers need guidance. Knowledge preserved, but not shared, becomes merely decoration. Learning that doesn't deepen faith becomes academic vanity." She stood slowly from the reading chair, the same careful movement I remembered from her final months when arthritis had made sudden gestures painful and difficult. As she moved away from the alcove, the candlelight gradually faded, leaving only the electric lamps that provided normal illumination for evening library work. I examined the reading chair, where Sister Agatha had been sitting. The seat cushion was still warm, as if someone had just vacated it, and the air held the faint scent of lavender soap that had always marked her presence among the living. The Bible remained open to Ecclesiastes, though I distinctly remembered seeing her close it before standing to leave. The following evening, Sister Agatha appeared again in the same corner alcove, reading by the same mysterious candlelight that seemed to emanate from her presence rather than from any physical source. This time, she was studying what appeared to be our collection of patristic texts, the writings of early church fathers that had been her particular area of scholarly expertise during her decades of library service. Over the following weeks, I established a routine of acknowledging Sister Agatha's presence during my evening work, without attempting to interrupt her studies or engage her in extended conversation. She seemed to be working through our most challenging theological texts in systematic order, spending multiple sessions with complex works that required careful attention and deep contemplation. Occasionally, she would offer brief guidance when I struggled with cataloging decisions or questions about our collection's organization. Her advice was always practical and precisely focused on the specific problem I was facing, delivered in the same gentle but authoritative tone she had used during her earthly mentorship of students and younger librarians. The Aquinas commentaries belong with systematic theology, not historical studies. She observed one evening when I was uncertain about proper classification for a new acquisition, "Theological synthesis transcends historical period. It addresses eternal questions that each generation must consider anew. Remember that preservation serves scholarship, but scholarship serves faith." She reminded me another night when I was becoming overly concerned with technical details of environmental control systems. The books exist to transform hearts, not merely to occupy shelf space in perfect condition. During the weeks before Christmas, Sister Agatha's nocturnal study sessions became more frequent and more intensive. She worked through our entire collection of mystical theology, spending long hours with texts by John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, and Meister Eckhart that explored the deepest mysteries of contemplative prayer and union with the divine. On Christmas Eve, as I was completing final preparations for our holiday closure of the library, Sister Agatha looked up from her reading and spoke more extensively than she had during any previous encounter. "Thank you for maintaining the library standards, Sister Grace," she said with unmistakable gratitude. "The collection is in capable hands. But remember, libraries exist to create readers, not merely to house books. Share the wisdom these texts contain. Guide others toward the knowledge that transforms understanding into wisdom, and wisdom into love." She closed the book she had been reading, our first edition of The Interior Castle, and placed it carefully on the reading table. "I've finished my review," she said with satisfaction. "The collection is complete and properly maintained. The readers who come seeking truth will find what they need." As she stood to leave the alcove for what I somehow knew would be the final time, Sister Agatha paused beside my circulation desk and placed one translucent hand briefly on my shoulder. "The library belongs to the community now, Sister Grace. but it will always carry the love of everyone who has served knowledge in faithful devotion to the truth that sets souls free. I never saw Sister Agatha again during my evening work sessions, though the corner alcove where she had conducted her posthumous studies retained a sense of warmth and presence that suggested her spiritual connection to our collection might continue in ways invisible to ordinary observation. The library continues serving our community and visiting researchers with the same dedication to scholarly excellence that Sister Agatha maintained during her 38 years of faithful service. But sometimes, during quiet evening hours when I'm working alone among our theological texts, I catch the faint scent of lavender soap and feel the gentle presence of someone who understood that libraries are sacred spaces where earthly knowledge becomes a pathway to eternal wisdom. The books she loved remain available to readers who come seeking truth, and perhaps her guidance continues in ways that transcend the limitations of physical presence while honoring the eternal relationship between faithful scholarship and deepening understanding of divine mystery. Some callings transcend death, continuing their gentle ministry in realms beyond earthly perception. My name is Sister Mary Paul, and I serve as night supervisor in the infirmary at Sacred Heart Convent in the hills of Tennessee, where I monitor the health and comfort of our elderly sisters during the quiet hours when medical emergencies are most likely to occur, and pastoral care becomes particularly important for those approaching the end of their earthly pilgrimage. The work requires both clinical knowledge and spiritual sensitivity, as I provide not only medical monitoring, but also the human presence that can ease the loneliness and fear that sometimes accompany serious illness. Our infirmary occupies the ground floor of the convent's newest wing, with 12 private rooms arranged around a central nursing station that allows continuous observation of all patients while maintaining appropriate privacy for personal prayer and family visits. Each room is furnished simply but comfortably, with hospital beds, bedside altars for religious images, and large windows that provide views of our gardens and the distant mountains that have sheltered our contemplative community for over 90 years. The night shift extends from 11 p.m. until 7 a.m., during which I make regular rounds to check vital signs, administer medications, and provide assistance with personal needs that arise during the vulnerable hours when the body's defenses are lowest and the spirit often struggles with questions about mortality and eternal destiny. Many of our sisters spend their final days in these rooms, surrounded by the prayers and gentle care that ease the transition from earthly life to whatever lies beyond the veil of mortal experience. Sister Ignatius had been our unofficial minister to the dying before her peaceful death from heart failure 6 months ago. Though she held no formal title or medical training, she possessed an extraordinary gift for providing comfort to sisters who were approaching death, offering silent presence and gentle touch that seemed to ease their fears and help them find peace during their final hours. Her ministry was entirely voluntary. She would simply appear at the bedside of dying sisters, hold their hands, and remain with them until their earthly journey concluded. During her 47 years of religious life, Sister Ignatius had been present at the deaths of over 60 sisters, providing the kind of peaceful companionship that allowed them to die with dignity and serenity, rather than alone and frightened. She never spoke during these vigils, but her presence communicated profound love and acceptance that transcended words. Many sisters requested specifically that Sister Ignatius be called if they became seriously ill, knowing that her quiet ministry would help them face death with faith rather than terror. She died quietly in her sleep on a Wednesday night in March, found the next morning by Sister Catherine when she failed to appear for morning prayers. Her death was entirely peaceful, no struggle, no apparent distress, simply the gentle cessation of breath that comes to those who have lived long lives in faithful service to others. We buried her in our small cemetery after a funeral mass that emphasized her decades of compassionate ministry to dying sisters and her quiet, but profound influence on our community's approach to mortality and grief. For the first month after Sister Ignatius's death, several of our elderly sisters expressed concern about who would provide the kind of comfort she had offered during serious illness. Sister Margaret, who was 89 and struggling with various health problems, specifically requested that someone with Sister Ignatius's gift for peaceful presence be assigned to stay with her when her time came. But no one in our community possessed the particular combination of spiritual sensitivity and natural comfort with death that had marked Sister Ignatius's extraordinary ministry. It was during my third week of night shifts after Sister Ignatius's funeral that I first noticed something unusual during my regular patient rounds. Sister Bernadette, who was dying from complications of advanced cancer, was not alone in her room, despite the late hour and the absence of any scheduled visitors. Sitting beside her bed in the wooden chair we provided for family members was an elderly nun I recognized immediately as Sister Ignatius. The same weathered face, the same gentle expression, the same black habit she had worn throughout her decades of religious life. She was holding Sister Bernadette's hand in both of her own, exactly as she had done during countless death vigils throughout her earthly ministry. Her presence seemed to radiate the same profound peace that had marked her living comfort of dying sisters, creating an atmosphere of serenity that filled the entire room with tangible calm. Sister Bernadette appeared more peaceful than she had been during previous days, when pain and anxiety had made rest difficult, despite our best efforts with medication and pastoral care. Her breathing was slow and regular, her facial expression relaxed and content, as if Sister Ignatius's presence had provided exactly the comfort she needed during these final hours of life. I stood in the doorway for several minutes, uncertain whether to enter the room or respect the sacred nature of what appeared to be Sister Ignatius's continuing ministry to the dying. The scene was both impossible and completely natural impossible because Sister Ignatius had been dead for weeks. Natural, because her presence at the bedside of a dying sister perfectly matched the pattern she had maintained throughout her religious life. When I finally entered the room to check Sister Bernadette's vital signs, Sister Ignatius looked up at me with the same gentle smile I remembered from countless previous encounters during her earthly service. She didn't speak, but her expression conveyed gratitude for my presence and understanding that Sister Bernadette was receiving exactly the kind of care she needed during this sacred transition. As I completed my nursing duties, Sister Ignatius continued holding Sister Bernadette's hand, occasionally adjusting her position to ensure maximum comfort, but never releasing the physical connection that seemed to anchor the dying woman to peace rather than fear. When I left the room, Sister Ignatius remained at her post, maintaining the faithful vigil that had characterized her ministry for nearly 5 decades. Sister Bernadette died peacefully 3 hours later, with Sister Ignatius holding her hand until the moment her breathing ceased. When I returned to the room after receiving the notification from our monitoring equipment, I found Sister Bernadette's body in perfect repose, her face reflecting the same serene expression that had marked Sister Ignatius's presence throughout the night. Sister Ignatius herself had vanished, leaving only the lingering scent of lavender and old roses that had always accompanied her presence among the living. This pattern repeated with remarkable consistency over the following months. Whenever one of our elderly sisters approached death, Sister Ignatius would appear in their room during the night shift, providing the same silent comfort and gentle presence that had marked her earthly ministry. She never appeared to sisters who were merely ill or recovering from minor health problems, only to those who were actively dying and needed the particular kind of spiritual support that eases the transition from earthly life to eternal rest. Her presence always had the same effect on dying sisters. Anxiety and fear would dissolve into peaceful acceptance. Pain would become manageable even when medications had provided limited relief, and the final hours would pass with dignity and serenity, rather than struggle and distress. Family members who happened to be present during Sister Ignatius's nocturnal visits often commented on the profound peace that filled the room, though they didn't seem to see her physical presence. Sister Margaret, who had specifically requested Sister Ignatius's comfort during her final illness, died on a quiet Thursday night, with Sister Ignatius holding her hand and whispering what appeared to be prayers for the dying. Though I couldn't hear the words Sister Ignatius spoke, Sister Margaret's final expression was one of profound gratitude and peaceful trust, as if she had received exactly the spiritual comfort she had hoped for during her transition to eternal life. Mother Superior, when I finally shared my observations about Sister Ignatius's continuing ministry, listened with the thoughtful attention of someone who had witnessed many mysteries during her decades of religious leadership. She asked careful questions about the timing and consistency of Sister Ignatius's appearances, then spent considerable time reflecting on the theological implications of what I was reporting. Sister Ignatius spent her entire religious life in service to dying sisters, Mother Superior observed finally. Perhaps death simply relocated her ministry rather than ending it. Perhaps some forms of love are too essential to be interrupted by the transition from earthly to eternal life. She paused, studying my face with pastoral concern. If Sister Ignatius continues to provide comfort to our dying sisters, and if her presence brings peace during their final hours, then perhaps we should simply accept this as another manifestation of the grace that sustains all authentic ministry, whether offered by the living or the dead. I continue making night rounds through our infirmary, monitoring the health and comfort of elderly sisters who spend their final days in our care. Sister Ignatius's nocturnal ministry has become an accepted part of our community's approach to death and dying. Though I'm the only staff member who regularly observes her continuing presence at the bedsides of sisters who are approaching the end of their earthly pilgrimage. Each time I encounter Sister Ignatius during her posthumous vigils, I'm reminded that love expressed in faithful service transcends the boundaries imposed by physical death. Her ministry to dying sisters continues with the same gentle dedication she brought to this calling during her earthly life, providing comfort that bridges the gap between mortality and whatever lies beyond, in the mystery of eternal existence. Some vocations are too important to be abandoned at death, and some forms of care are too essential to be limited by the normal boundaries between earthly service and heavenly ministry. Sister Ignatius's continuing presence among our dying sisters serves as a gentle reminder that authentic love finds ways to persist, even when death appears to have severed all earthly connections. Some stains penetrate deeper than silver polish can reach, marking sacred objects with the weight of unresolved spiritual struggles. My name is Sister Teresa, and I serve as sacristan at Our Lady of Perpetual Hope Convent in the mountains of West Virginia, where I maintain our chapel's sacred vessels, liturgical linens, and religious artifacts that support our community's daily worship and special celebrations throughout the liturgical year. Among my most cherished responsibilities is caring for our altar cross, a beautiful silver piece crafted by local artisans in 1968 and blessed by 3 different bishops. During the decades, it has graced our sanctuary with its silent witness to the crucified love that anchors all Christian faith. The cross stands 18 inches tall on our main altar, positioned behind the tabernacle where it catches the morning light that streams through our eastern windows during the dawn masses that begin each contemplative day. The silver is of exceptional quality, requiring weekly polishing to maintain its lustrous appearance, but rewarding careful maintenance with a brilliance that seems to emanate spiritual as well as physical light throughout our stone chapel. Over my 12 years as sacristan, I've developed intimate familiarity with every detail of our sacred vessels and liturgical appointments. The altar cross, in particular, has become a source of personal devotion as well as professional responsibility. Its elegant proportions and fine craftsmanship serve as daily reminders of the sacrifice that transforms human suffering into redemptive love. I've always found profound satisfaction in maintaining its pristine condition, ensuring that this central symbol of our faith reflects the reverence and care that marks our community's approach to liturgical worship. Sister Assumpta had been one of our most devout members before her sudden death from a heart attack 6 weeks ago. During her 38 years of religious life, she had served in various capacities: teacher, librarian, the retreat director, always with the kind of intense dedication that marked her as someone completely committed to contemplative spirituality and theological study. Her death came without warning during evening prayers, when she simply collapsed at her pew and died before medical assistance could be summoned. What made Sister Assumpta's death particularly troubling was the spiritual crisis she had confided to Mother Superior during her final months. According to conversations that Mother Superior shared with our community after the funeral, Sister Assumpta had been struggling with profound doubts about her faith, questions about God's existence, the validity of religious life, and the meaning of suffering that had shaken her theological certainties and left her feeling spiritually adrift. She felt as though she had lost God, Mother Superior explained during our memorial service. The prayers that had sustained her for decades seemed empty. The scriptures that had provided guidance felt like ancient stories with no contemporary relevance, and the religious community that had been her home for nearly 40 years felt like a collection of strangers, pursuing illusions rather than truth. This kind of spiritual aridity wasn't uncommon among contemplatives who had devoted their lives to seeking divine union through prayer and study. But Sister Assumpta's crisis had been particularly severe, involving not just temporary dryness in prayer, but fundamental questions about whether her entire religious vocation had been based on self-deception rather than authentic spiritual calling. During her final weeks, Sister Assumpta had stopped participating in many community activities, attending only the required masses and prayer services, while spending most of her time in solitary reflection that seemed to deepen rather than resolve her spiritual confusion. Several sisters had attempted to offer support and companionship, but Sister Assumpta had withdrawn into an isolation that suggested profound inner turmoil. The morning after Sister Assumpta's funeral, I discovered that our altar cross had tarnished overnight, despite my careful polishing the previous evening. The silver had developed a dark patina that covered the entire surface, transforming the brilliant metal into something that appeared almost black in the chapel's dim lighting. This was puzzling, but not unprecedented. Silver objects sometimes tarnish rapidly under certain atmospheric conditions, particularly during periods of high humidity or chemical exposure. I applied our finest silver polish and spent considerable time restoring the cross to its normal lustrous condition, assuming that some unusual environmental factor had caused the accelerated tarnishing. But the next morning, I found the cross in exactly the same condition, completely blackened, despite my careful restoration work the previous day. This pattern continued for a week. Each morning, the altar cross would be tarnished beyond recognition, requiring extensive polishing to restore its proper appearance for morning mass. Each evening, after completing my cleaning duties, the cross would gleam with perfect brilliance, but by dawn, it would be blackened again, as if some unseen force was systematically destroying the lustrous finish that I worked so hard to maintain. I consulted with local experts about possible causes of such rapid tarnishing, exploring explanations ranging from atmospheric sulfur to chemical reactions with cleaning products. But none of the proposed solutions addressed the fundamental mystery. Why had this phenomenon begun exactly one day after Sister Assumpta's funeral? And why did it affect only our altar cross, while leaving other silver objects in the chapel completely unaffected? Sister Margaret, who assisted with altar preparations during major liturgical celebrations, confirmed that the tarnishing was limited to the main crucifix. Our silver candlesticks, communion vessels, and other liturgical appointments remained bright and untarnished, despite being exposed to the same environmental conditions that were supposedly causing the cross's daily blackening. After 2 weeks of futile attempts to solve this mystery through conventional means, I decided to approach the problem from a spiritual, rather than purely technical perspective. During my evening prayer before the Blessed Sacrament, I found myself studying the altar cross more carefully, trying to understand what might be causing its daily transformation from brilliant silver to dull black metal. As I knelt in prayer before the tabernacle, with the freshly polished cross gleaming in the candlelight behind it, I began to sense a presence in the chapel that hadn't been there during previous evening devotions. The sensation was difficult to describe, not threatening, but profoundly troubled, as if someone with deep spiritual anguish was sharing the sacred space with me. The temperature around the altar seemed to drop several degrees, and the candle flames began flickering, despite the absence of any detectable air movement. More disturbing was the gradual darkening of the silver cross, which I could observe happening in real time as I knelt in prayer. The lustrous metal slowly developed the familiar black patina, spreading from the base of the cross upward toward the figure of Christ, in a pattern that suggested deliberate intention rather than random chemical reaction. "Sister Assumpta," I whispered, suddenly understanding the connection between the cross's daily tarnishing and our departed sister's unresolved spiritual crisis. "Are you here? Are you trying to tell us something?" The flickering candles steadied immediately, and the sense of troubled presence became more focused, more personal. Though I couldn't see anything with my physical eyes, I felt as clearly as if someone had spoken aloud that Sister Assumpta was indeed present in the chapel, and that her posthumous suffering was somehow manifesting through the daily blackening of our altar cross. The tarnishing represented her lost faith, her spiritual darkness, her inability to find peace even in death, because she had died without resolving the doubts that had tormented her final months. The cross, symbol of redemptive suffering and divine love, was reflecting her continued anguish, her persistent inability to accept the grace that might heal her spiritual wounds and allow her to rest in eternal peace. I remained in prayer before the darkened cross for several hours, offering intercessions for Sister Assumpta's troubled soul and asking for guidance about how our community might help resolve whatever was preventing her from finding peace in death. The chapel felt heavy with unresolved grief and spiritual confusion, as if Sister Assumpta's crisis of faith was continuing beyond the grave and seeking some form of resolution that death alone couldn't provide. The next morning, I shared my insights with Mother Superior, though I struggled to find words that wouldn't sound like the fantasies of an overwrought imagination. Mother Superior listened carefully to my account, examined the freshly tarnished cross, and spent considerable time in silent reflection before responding to my observations. "Sister Assumpta died with unresolved doubts," she said finally. "Perhaps death hasn't healed the spiritual wounds that troubled her final months. Perhaps her continuing anguish is seeking the kind of assistance that only the prayers of the living can provide." She announced to our community that we would begin a novena of prayers, specifically for Sister Assumpta's soul, asking that God grant her the peace and faith that had eluded her during her final earthly struggles. For 9 consecutive days, we offered special intentions during all our prayer services, seeking divine mercy for our departed sister, and hoping that our intercessions might provide whatever spiritual healing she needed to rest in eternal peace. During the novena, the altar cross continued its daily tarnishing, but the process became gradually less severe. By the 7th day, the blackening was limited to the base of the cross, and by the 9th day, only a small area around the mounting showed any discoloration. On the morning after our final prayer service for Sister Assumpta, I found the cross completely free of tarnish, gleaming with a brilliance that seemed to exceed anything I had achieved through careful polishing. The cross has remained lustrous and untarnished since our novena concluded 6 months ago, requiring only routine weekly maintenance to preserve its natural beauty. But sometimes, during particularly solemn liturgical celebrations, I notice subtle variations in the way light reflects from its surface, moments when the silver seems to carry additional depth and warmth, as if it retains memory of the spiritual struggle it reflected during Sister Assumpta's posthumous crisis of faith. Our community learned through this experience that death doesn't automatically resolve the spiritual struggles that trouble souls during earthly life. Some crises of faith require the intercession of the living to reach their final resolution. And some forms of anguish can be healed only through the prayers and love that connect the communion of saints across the boundaries between mortality and eternal existence. The altar cross continues, serving as the focal point of our liturgical worship, but it also serves as a reminder that our prayers for the dead are not merely ceremonial obligations, but essential spiritual works that can provide real assistance to souls who remain troubled even after their earthly pilgrimage has ended. Sister Assumpta's struggle with faith found its resolution through our community's intercession, transforming her doubt into peace and her darkness into the brilliant light that now reflects from our carefully maintained symbol of redemptive love. Some duties echo beyond death, continuing with faithful precision in dimensions invisible to earthly observation. My name is Sister Josephine, and I serve as bell ringer at Mount Calvary Convent in the rolling farmland of Iowa, where I call our community to prayer 5 times daily through the bronze voice of our chapel bell that has marked the sacred hours for our contemplative schedule since the convent's founding in 1926. The responsibility requires precise timing and careful attention to the rhythm that distinguishes each call, the joyful peals for morning lauds, the measured tolling for midday prayer, and the gentle evening chimes that conclude our day with vespers. Our bell tower rises 40 feet above the chapel, housing a bronze bell cast in Belgium and blessed during our founding ceremony nearly a century ago. The bell mechanism operates through a traditional rope system that requires considerable skill to produce the complex patterns that mark different prayer services and special liturgical celebrations. The tower itself is accessible through a narrow spiral staircase that winds upward through stone walls, thick enough to muffle sound, while providing excellent acoustics for distributing the bell's voice across our rural community. During my 8 years as bell ringer, I've developed intimate familiarity with every nuance of our bell's voice and every subtlety of the rope technique required to achieve proper tone and timing. The evening call to vespers has always been my favorite responsibility. 7 gentle peals that float across our countryside as sunset colors fade into twilight, summoning our sisters to the night prayer that concludes each contemplative day with psalms of gratitude and peaceful surrender to divine providence. Sister Philomena had been my predecessor in this ministry, serving as bell ringer for 23 years before her sudden death from a heart attack 5 weeks ago. At 68, she had maintained perfect timing and remarkable stamina, climbing the narrow tower stairs twice daily and producing bell sequences that seemed to carry spiritual as well as auditory beauty throughout our agricultural valley. Her dedication to precise timing was legendary. Within our community, she would arrive at the tower exactly 3 minutes before each scheduled call, allowing time for the brief prayer she offered before touching the rope. She died on a Wednesday afternoon, while returning from the tower after the midday call to none. Sister Catherine found her collapsed on the chapel steps, apparently overcome by heart failure during her descent from the bell tower. The coroner determined that she had died instantly, with no suffering or prolonged distress. We buried her in our small cemetery after a funeral mass that included extended bell sequences in her honor, played by visiting bell ringers from other convents who had known and respected her skill throughout the region. Taking over Sister Philomena's responsibilities felt like inheriting sacred trust as well as technical duty. For the first month after her death, I struggled to achieve the subtle timing variations and tonal qualities that had marked her decades of faithful service. My bell ringing was adequate but lacked the musical sophistication and spiritual depth that had made Sister Philomena's calls to prayer memorable for everyone who heard them across our rural community. The first unusual incident occurred during my third week as official bell ringer, while I was performing the evening call to Vespers. As I pulled the rope in the familiar seven peal sequence that marked our transition from day to night prayer, I began to hear what sounded like an echo following each of my bell strokes. But the echo came approximately 3 seconds after each peal, rather than the immediate acoustic reflection that would be natural in our stone tower. At first, I assumed this was some kind of atmospheric phenomenon, perhaps sound waves reflecting off distant farm buildings or weather conditions that were creating unusual acoustic effects. But as I continued the evening sequence, the echo became more distinct and rhythmically precise, following my bell ringing with the kind of intentional timing that suggested deliberate human action rather than natural sound reflection. The echo matched my bell ringing perfectly, in terms of rhythm and intensity, but it carried a slightly different tonal quality, as if produced by the same bell, but pulled by different hands with their own distinctive technique. More unsettling was the consistency of the 3-second delay, which remained constant, regardless of my own timing variations or the spacing between individual peals. This pattern continued for several evenings, with a mysterious echo following every Vespers call but never appearing during morning bells or midday prayer announcements. The phenomenon seemed limited to the evening hours when Sister Philomena had always concluded our daily prayer schedule with her particularly beautiful rendition of the Vespers sequence that had become a beloved tradition throughout our rural community. After a week of this puzzling echo effect, I decided to investigate the bell tower more thoroughly, checking for mechanical problems or acoustic anomalies that might explain the delayed sound repetition. I climbed to the bell chamber during daylight hours, examining the bronze bell, the rope mechanism, and the stone walls for any structural issues that could create unusual sound patterns. Everything appeared normal. The bell hung properly in its mounting, the rope moved freely through its pulleys, and the tower walls showed no cracks or openings that might cause sound reflections. But as I prepared to descend from the tower, I noticed something that made my hands tremble as I gripped the stone railing. There was a second rope hanging beside the main bell rope, a rope that hadn't been there during my previous visits to the tower, and a rope that didn't appear in any of the maintenance records I had reviewed while learning the bell ringing responsibilities. The rope was identical to our primary bell rope in every detail. The same hemp construction, the same wear patterns, even the same knots that Sister Philomena had tied for hand grips during her decades of service. I examined this mysterious second rope carefully, testing its tension and following its path upward to the bell mounting. But the rope seemed to connect to nothing. It hung freely in the air, beside our functional bell rope, terminating approximately 6 feet above the tower floor in empty space, where no mechanical connection existed. That evening, I decided to remain in the bell tower after completing the Vespers call, hoping to observe directly whatever was causing the 3-second echo that had puzzled me for weeks. I positioned myself in the shadows near the tower stairs, where I could watch the bell area without being visible to anyone who might enter the chamber. At exactly 6:03 p.m., 3 minutes after I had completed the official Vespers sequence, the mysterious second rope began moving by itself. The rope was being pulled by invisible hands in precisely the same 7-peal pattern I had just completed, creating the delayed echo I had been hearing from the chapel below. But what made my heart race with terror and wonder was the gradual appearance of a figure grasping the rope, translucent at first, then becoming more solid and recognizable as the sequence continued. Sister Philomena stood at the second rope, pulling it with the same careful technique and focused concentration she had maintained during her 23 years of bell-ringing service. She wore the same black habit, moved with the same deliberate precision, and maintained the same expression of prayerful attention that had marked her approach to this ministry throughout her religious life. Her movements were perfectly synchronized with the rope's motion, though she appeared to exist in some dimension parallel to our physical reality. The bell she was ringing produced real sound, the echo I had been hearing for weeks, but the bell itself remained invisible, while the rope moved in response to her pull. As Sister Philomena completed the Vespers sequence, she looked toward my hiding place, with the gentle smile I remembered from countless previous encounters during her earthly service. She didn't speak, but her expression conveyed both gratitude for my presence and understanding that her continuing ministry was somehow necessary for maintaining the spiritual rhythm that had sustained our community's prayer life for decades. "Sister Philomena," I whispered, stepping out from the shadows near the staircase, "why have you returned? Is there something you need to finish?" She completed one final peal of her invisible bell, then released the rope and turned to face me directly. Though her voice seemed to come from very far away, her words were clear and unmistakably her own. "The bells must ring properly, Sister Josephine," she said with the same patient instruction she had provided to younger sisters throughout her religious life. "The evening prayer deserves the same beauty that has called our community to Vespers for nearly a century. I cannot rest until I know the bells will continue singing with the voice our sisters expect and deserve." She gestured toward the primary bell rope that I used for official duties. "Your technique is improving, but you haven't yet learned the subtle timing that transforms mere bell ringing into musical prayer. The Vespers call requires special attention. It marks the transition from earthly work to heavenly contemplation." Over the following weeks, Sister Philomena appeared in the bell tower each evening after I completed the official Vespers call, demonstrating through her invisible bell the enhanced techniques and spiritual approach that had marked her decades of accomplished service. I began to understand that her posthumous bell ringing wasn't merely an echo of my own work, but an advanced lesson in the art she had mastered during her earthly ministry. I started adjusting my own technique based on Sister Philomena's demonstrations, paying closer attention to the subtle timing variations and tonal qualities that transformed functional bell ringing into something approaching musical art. Gradually, my Vespers calls began to approach the standard Sister Philomena had maintained, carrying the same spiritual beauty that had made our evening prayer announcements memorable throughout our rural community. As my own skill improved, Sister Philomena's posthumous demonstrations became less frequent and less visible. By Christmas, her evening appearances had faded to barely perceptible movements of the mysterious second rope, and by Easter, the rope itself had vanished entirely from the bell tower. But the lessons she had provided continued to influence my approach to bell ringing, particularly during the evening Vespers calls that conclude each contemplative day with musical invitation to prayer. My technique now carries echoes of her wisdom and spiritual insight, transforming the simple act of rope pulling into a form of worship that honors both the traditional beauty of monastic bell ringing and the continuing presence of those who have served this ministry with extraordinary dedication. I continue climbing to our bell tower 5 times daily, calling our community to prayer through the bronze voice that has marked sacred time for nearly a century. Though Sister Philomena no longer appears in visible form, her influence persists. In every evening call to Vespers, a reminder that faithful service creates legacies that transcend death while maintaining the spiritual beauty that connects earthly worship to eternal praise. The bells ring now, with voices that blend past and present, carrying forward the accumulated wisdom of all who have served this ministry, while remaining open to the continuing guidance that flows from the communion of saints who maintain their care for earthly communities, even from realms beyond. Mortal perception. Time collapses in sacred spaces, revealing the eternal nature of vows that transcend the boundaries between past and present. My name is Sister Catherine, and I have served at Our Lady of Divine Providence Convent for 52 years, currently holding the position of Ritual Coordinator, responsible for preparing our chapel for the sacred ceremonies that mark significant moments in our community's spiritual life. Among the most profound of these celebrations are final vows, when novices complete their formation period and commit themselves permanently to religious life through solemn promises of poverty, chastity, and obedience that bind them to our contemplative community until death. These ceremonies require meticulous preparation, arranging flowers, positioning candles, preparing the altar with special linens and sacred vessels, and ensuring that every detail reflects the solemnity and joy appropriate to such life-changing commitments. During my decades of service, I have prepared our chapel for 63 final vow ceremonies, each one unique yet connected to the eternal pattern of religious dedication that has sustained monastic communities for over 15 centuries. Our chapel maintains the same basic arrangement it has held since the convent's founding in 1923, with oak pews facing a simple altar dominated by a large crucifix and flanked by statues of Mary and Joseph. The sanctuary area can accommodate the special seating arrangements required for vow ceremonies, when the entire community gathers to witness and celebrate a sister's permanent commitment to religious life within our contemplative tradition. Tomorrow marks the 50th anniversary of my own final vows, taken in this same chapel on October 15th, 1973, when I was 24 years old and filled with the nervous excitement that accompanies such momentous spiritual decisions. Mother Superior Beatrice had presided over that ceremony, guiding me through the ancient ritual with the same gentle authority she brought to all significant community events during her 37 years of leadership before her death from cancer in 1978. This evening, I was preparing the chapel for Sister Maria's final vows, scheduled for tomorrow morning, when our entire community would gather to witness her permanent commitment to religious life after 3 years of novitiate formation. The preparation work was familiar, but never routine. Each vow ceremony deserves the same careful attention to beauty and reverence that honors the magnitude of the commitment being made. As I arranged the white flowers that traditionally grace the altar during vow ceremonies, I found myself remembering my own final vows 5 decades ago. The mixture of anticipation and serenity that had marked that transformative morning, the sense of stepping across a threshold that would define the rest of my earthly existence, the profound joy of formally joining the community that had become my spiritual home during 3 years of discernment and formation. The chapel was filled with the soft light of late afternoon, filtering through our stained glass windows, creating pools of colored illumination that danced across the oak pews and stone altar. I had completed most of the preparation work and was making final adjustments to the floral arrangements when I heard voices coming from the sanctuary area. Women's voices engaged in what sounded like the formal responses that mark religious ceremonies. My first assumption was that some of our sisters had decided to practice tomorrow's liturgy, rehearsing the complex ritual that coordinates the actions of the presiding superior, the novice making vows, and the community witnessing this sacred commitment. Such preparation wasn't unusual for significant ceremonies, though I hadn't been informed about any scheduled rehearsal for this evening. But as I listened more carefully to the voices, I realized that what I was hearing wasn't a practice session, but an actual vow ceremony in progress. The responses were too solemn, too spiritually charged to be mere rehearsal. Someone was taking final vows in our chapel, despite the fact that Sister Maria's ceremony wasn't scheduled until tomorrow morning. I approached the sanctuary area cautiously, uncertain whether I should interrupt what appeared to be a private ceremony or quietly withdraw to avoid disturbing whatever was taking place. But as I drew closer to the altar, I could see the participants in this mysterious ritual more clearly, and what I observed made my hands tremble and my heart race with inexplicable recognition. A young woman in a white habit knelt before the altar in the traditional position for final vows, her hands folded in prayer and her head bowed in reverent attention to the solemn words being spoken over her. Standing behind the altar in the position reserved for the presiding superior was an elderly nun I recognized immediately as Mother Superior Beatrice. The same gentle face, the same authoritative presence, the same black habit she had worn throughout her decades of leadership. Mother Superior Beatrice was leading the young novice through the ancient formula of religious vows, speaking with the same careful pronunciation and spiritual gravity that had marked her presidency over countless such ceremonies during her earthly service. Her voice carried clearly through the chapel, reciting words that connected this individual commitment to the eternal pattern of religious dedication that transcends any particular moment or community. Do you promise to live in poverty, chastity, and obedience according to the rule of our community, seeking God through contemplative prayer and faithful service until death calls you to eternal union with the divine love that has drawn you to this sacred commitment? The young novice responded with clear conviction. I do so promise, with God's grace and the support of my sisters in religious life. As she spoke these words, the novice raised her head and turned toward where I stood near the chapel entrance. When I saw her face clearly in the candlelight that surrounded the altar area, I gasped audibly and stepped backward against the rear pew. The young woman making final vows was myself, not someone who resembled me, but my own face, exactly as it had appeared 50 years ago, when I had knelt in this same sanctuary and made the same solemn promises to Mother Superior Beatrice on the morning that had defined the direction of my entire religious life. She smiled at me with the radiant joy I remembered feeling during my own vow ceremony, the deep happiness that comes from finally arriving at a destination the soul has been seeking throughout years of prayer and discernment. Her expression held recognition and gratitude, as if my presence as an observer somehow completed the sacred circle that connected past commitment to present fulfillment. Mother Superior Beatrice continued the vow ceremony with the same dignity and spiritual authority she had maintained during her earthly leadership, placing her hands on the young novice's head in the traditional gesture of blessing and acceptance. May God accept your offering and grant you perseverance in the path you have chosen. May our community support you in faithful living of these vows, and may your dedication inspire others to seek the divine love that calls all souls to perfect union. The ceremony concluded with the traditional singing of the Te Deum, though the voices seemed to come from a congregation far larger than the two participants I could see in the sanctuary. The melody filled the chapel with harmonies that suggested the presence of our entire community throughout its nearly century-long history. Sisters from past decades joining their voices to celebrate vows that transcended any particular moment in time. As the final notes of the hymn faded into silence, both figures began to fade as well, becoming translucent and then invisible, while the chapel returned to the quiet emptiness I had expected to find during my preparation work. The candles I had lit for tomorrow's ceremony continued burning on the altar, and the flowers I had arranged remained in their carefully planned positions, but the mysterious vow ceremony had vanished as completely as if it had never occurred. Yet the chapel retained a sense of sacred presence and profound joy that seemed to linger in the air, like incense or the echo of prayer. The space felt consecrated in a way that went beyond ordinary liturgical preparation, as if it had been blessed by the intersection of past and present, memory and hope, individual commitment, and eternal purpose. The next morning, Sister Maria made her final vows in the same sanctuary where I had witnessed my own ceremony repeated the previous evening. As she knelt before our current Mother Superior and recited the ancient promises that would bind her to religious life until death, I found myself seeing the event through multiple dimensions of time, past, present, and future colliding in the sacred moment that transforms individual lives while connecting them to the eternal community of souls who have chosen contemplative service as their path to divine union. During Sister Maria's ceremony, I caught brief glimpses of other figures in the chapel, shadowy presences that might have been previous generations of sisters who had made similar vows in this same sacred space, their spiritual presence lending depth and continuity to a ritual that transcends any single moment while gathering eternal significance through countless repetitions across decades of faithful commitment. Our Lady of Divine Providence Convent continues welcoming young women who feel called to contemplative religious life, and I continue preparing our chapel for the vow ceremonies that mark their permanent commitment to this ancient path of seeking God through prayer, community, and service. But I now understand that these individual ceremonies participate in something far larger than any single commitment. They join the eternal liturgy of souls who have chosen to dedicate their lives to the divine love that transcends time, while manifesting through the faithful dedication of ordinary women who discover extraordinary purpose through surrender to mystery that exceeds human comprehension. The vows we make in time echo in eternity, creating bonds that death cannot sever and commitments that find their ultimate fulfillment in realms beyond earthly perception. Sister Maria's final vows yesterday joined her to a community that extends far beyond our current membership, connecting her to the communion of saints who continue their contemplative service in dimensions where temporal limitations dissolve into the eternal present of divine love, perfectly received and perfectly returned.